It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me and the wilderness. A chance to get away from the noise, the screens, and the endless stream of people. I had been planning this camping trip for months, looking forward to the peace that only nature could provide. The weather was perfect when I arrived at the campsite, with clear skies and a crisp breeze cutting through the trees. I was excited to finally disconnect. I arrived at a remote campground that I'd researched online, a spot that was known for being a bit off the beaten path. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find packed with families or weekend warriors. It was a hidden gem, or so it seemed. The site was nestled between two steep hills, surrounded by dense forest. The kind of forest where the trees were so thick that it felt like night even during the day. The kind of forest that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. Setting up camp was routine for me. I'd done this plenty of times before, so it was second nature. I pitched my tent, arranged my gear, and got the fire going with ease. It felt like the perfect spot to relax. Just me and the sounds of nature. I had everything I needed. Food, water, a few books to read, and my camera to capture whatever wildlife I might come across. For a while, everything felt calm, peaceful. The birds were chirping, the wind rustled through the leaves, and the occasional distant snap of a twig reminded me that I wasn't alone in the woods. As the sun began to set, I made myself a simple dinner, enjoying the solitude of the evening. The fire crackled and popped, casting a warm glow that contrasted against the cool darkness of the woods around me. I sat there for a while, watching the flames dance, lost in thought. It was then that I heard something, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush nearby. First, I brushed it off. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon, looking for food. But then the sound came again, this time closer. It wasn't the gentle rustling of animals foraging. It was heavier, more deliberate, like something or someone was walking through the brush. I stood up slowly, trying to peer into the darkness, but all I could make out were the shifting shadows of the trees. My heart began to beat a little faster, not because I was scared, but because the noise felt wrong. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered before. The weight of the footsteps, the rhythm, it wasn't natural. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't land on anything. No animal, no figure, nothing. Just trees and the stillness of the night. I lowered the flashlight, feeling a sense of unease settle over me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone in the wilderness, and I'd read enough campfire stories to know that solitude could sometimes make you see things that weren't there. I decided to ignore it, telling myself that it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a large predator, moving through the woods. I wasn't in any real danger, right? So, I returned to my camp, tried to shake off the tension, and focused on the fire. The night grew colder, and the forest around me became more alive with the sounds of the night. Insects chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. But every now and then, I would hear it again. The sound, closer this time. It wasn't the sound of animals moving through the brush. It was something else, something heavier. I stood up again, flashlight in hand, scanning the area around my campsite. There was nothing, just the deep shadows of the forest stretching out in every direction. I had to remind myself that I was in the middle of nowhere. Of course, there would be strange sounds. Animals were unpredictable, and the forest had its own language. I decided to go for a walk, hoping to clear my head. I wasn't sure if it was the silence of the night or my nerves getting the best of me, but I needed to move. I grabbed my jacket and stepped away from the campfire, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the ground in front of me. The woods looked different now, less inviting and more ominous. The trees seemed to stretch taller, their twisted limbs reaching for the sky like gnarled fingers. I walked slowly, trying to keep my bearings as I ventured further into the forest. The further I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of nature seemed to fade into nothing, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves and twigs beneath me. I walked for about 20 minutes, following a narrow trail that I had assumed would loop back to the campsite. But as I continued, I began to notice something strange. There were no animal tracks. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of wildlife at all. The forest felt empty. It wasn't right. I stopped, turning around to head back to camp. But when I did, I realized something that made my stomach drop. I couldn't see the glow of my campfire. I looked around, trying to orient myself, but the trees all looked the same in the dim light. I had wandered too far. Panic set in for a moment. I cursed under my breath and tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My flashlight's beam flickered as I turned in circles, trying to get a sense of where I was. Nothing looked familiar. My heart began to race, and the night air felt colder. Then I heard it again, the sound, the heavy steps moving through the brush. It was closer this time, much closer. My skin prickled with fear as I held the flashlight out in front of me, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was moving through the woods. But again, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig. I turned quickly and began to walk faster, trying to get back to camp as quickly as possible. The path seemed to twist and turn, and I found myself growing disoriented. My breath came in short bursts as I quickened my pace, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there with me. Was someone else out here? Or was I just losing my mind? The steps came again, this time closer than ever. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could hear it. Heavy footsteps crunching the leaves and dirt. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight's beam bobbed wildly as I sprinted through the forest, trying to find any sign of my campsite. But the deeper I ran, the more lost I felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, and I had no idea if I was running in circles or heading in the right direction. Suddenly, I stumbled over something, probably a rock or a root, and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flew from my hand, rolling away into the darkness. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my body aching from the fall. I could hear the sound now, unmistakable, the heavy footsteps, right behind me. I scrambled to my feet, desperately searching for the flashlight. My hand brushed against the cold metal of the light, and I grabbed it, clicking it back on. The beam illuminated the area around me, but again, there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the dark forest. But then, I saw something just on the edge of the light, a shadow. It was tall, and it moved quickly across the forest floor. I froze, my blood running cold. This wasn't my imagination. Something was out here with me, and it wasn't an animal. I ran again, no longer caring about staying on a path. I just needed to get back to the campsite. The trees blurred as I sprinted, branches slapping at my face and arms. My breath was ragged, and I felt like I was being chased, though I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. The silence returned, but this time, it was more oppressive than before. Finally, I saw it, the flicker of light through the trees. My campfire. It was still burning, its warm glow cutting through the darkness. I ran toward it, stumbling over roots and uneven ground, not stopping until I reached the camp. I collapsed beside the fire, panting heavily, my body shaking with adrenaline. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the shadows, but there was nothing. The forest was still, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. I sat there for hours, too shaken to sleep, too terrified to leave the fire's warmth. The feeling of being watched never left me, and I stayed close to the campfire the entire night. When morning finally came, I packed up my things in a hurry and left. I didn't look back. When I reached the car, I realized that I hadn't heard those footsteps again, but the memory of them, the sound, the feeling of being hunted, stayed with me long after I left the woods. I didn't know who or what had been following me, but I was certain of one thing. Whatever it was real, and it knew exactly where I was. I had never been much of a camper. The idea of being out in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional animal, always seemed a bit too risky. But when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip in the mountains, I decided to give it a shot. Maybe it would be fun. Maybe I could finally prove to myself that I wasn't as soft as I thought. We set off early in the morning, driving for a few hours to reach the spot we had picked. It wasn't a popular campsite. It was a little more secluded. That's what made it appealing, right? The thought of being away from the noise of civilization, surrounded by nothing but nature. The first day was a breeze. We found a nice spot near a creek, set up our tents, and started a fire. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, with just the right amount of sunlight breaking through the trees. We spent the evening by the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about nothing important. For a moment, I actually felt relaxed. I was starting to see the appeal of camping. The next morning, we woke up early to explore the area. The woods were dense, and the trail was a bit overgrown, but we were all in high spirits. We spent hours hiking, occasionally stopping to take pictures or rest. I wasn't in the best shape, but I kept pushing myself to keep up with the group. Eventually, we came across a small clearing, a perfect spot to sit and have some water. It felt like we were miles away from any human contact. I liked the feeling of isolation. After our break, we decided to head back to camp. The trail we'd taken was starting to feel less familiar. The trees seemed thicker, the ground more uneven. I was starting to wonder if we had gotten off track, but I didn't want to say anything and sound paranoid. Plus, I could hear the creek in the distance, so we weren't completely lost. We should have been able to find our way back with no problem. But something started to feel off. There was an unsettling silence in the air. The usual sounds of birds and wind through the leaves had disappeared. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to brush it off, but a nagging feeling crept up in the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. We kept walking, but the trail was starting to look more like a maze. I couldn't remember passing that huge rock formation, and that fallen log definitely wasn't there before. I wasn't sure if I should say anything yet, but the unease in my gut was growing stronger. By the time we realized we were lost, it was getting late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. The group started to argue, each person suggesting a different way to go, but no one really knew where we were. The air felt colder now, and the sounds of the forest had returned, but they were all wrong. The birds were silent, the rustling leaves felt unnatural, and every now and then, I swore I heard something moving just outside our line of sight. I tried not to think too much about it. We decided to split up, each group heading in a different direction, hoping to find the trail again. I stayed with one of my friends, but after what felt like hours of walking in circles, it became clear that we weren't getting anywhere. The woods were starting to feel less like a beautiful, tranquil place and more like a labyrinth. We ended up back at the clearing we'd passed earlier. My heart sank when I recognized it. We hadn't made any progress. It was like the forest was playing tricks on us, trapping us in a loop. The others were nowhere to be seen. By now, the sky was a dark shade of purple, the sun completely gone behind the mountains. I wasn't worried about wild animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. I started to feel the weight of the situation. We were lost, and the temperature was dropping quickly. I decided to start a fire. We gathered some wood, and I managed to get it going with the few matches we had left. The flames flickered to life, casting long shadows around the camp. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the entire clearing. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting something to appear from the darkness. I tried to push those thoughts aside. The others would find us soon, I told myself. They had to. Night fell completely, and the fire was our only source of light. The shadows seemed to stretch farther and farther, as if they were trying to reach us. Every gust of wind through the trees felt like someone was moving around us. I tried to reassure myself that it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Hours passed, and still no sign of the others. I wanted to wait by the fire, but the constant feeling of being watched was too much. I decided to go back down the trail. I told myself that I just needed to walk a little farther, and maybe I'd find someone else. But as I walked, something in the forest started to shift. The trees, once peaceful and calming, now loomed over me like giants. The darkness seemed to close in, and the air grew colder. I couldn't help but feel like I was being led deeper into the woods, far away from the safety of the fire. After what felt like hours of wandering, I finally found the others. They were sitting by a small fire, huddled together. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. They had been searching for me, they said. They hadn't seen me at all. It didn't make sense. I had been walking in the woods for so long, yet I hadn't seen anyone else. I asked them if they had heard me calling out, but they said no. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. We stayed close to the fire, too scared to move too far from the warmth. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder, more intense. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. We were all on edge, and no one spoke much. We just stared into the fire, hoping it would keep the fear at bay. By morning, we were all exhausted. We hadn't slept a wink, and the fatigue was taking its toll. But we needed to leave. We had to get out of these woods. We packed up our gear quickly, and with heavy hearts, we began the long trek back to the car. It wasn't easy. Our feet were sore, and we had no idea where the trail was anymore. But after what felt like an eternity, we finally saw the road. The moment we reached the car, I felt like I could breathe again. We didn't talk much during the drive home. We were all too shaken, too tired. The woods had felt like a maze, a trap. I don't know if it was the isolation, the darkness, or something else entirely, but that night in the woods felt wrong. It didn't feel like just a camping trip gone awry. It felt like something bigger, something beyond our control. We never went back to that spot. None of us even mentioned it again. But I've never forgotten that feeling, the feeling of being lost, not just in the woods, but in something I couldn't understand. Something that, for just a moment, made the forest feel like a dangerous, endless void. And as much as I try to forget, I still can't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, we weren't as alone as we thought out there. I woke up early that day, before the sun had fully risen, with the crisp mountain air cutting through the fabric of my tent. The kind of air that makes you feel alive, as if it's the first breath you've taken after being underwater for too long. It was going to be one of those perfect mornings, quiet, calm, and full of promise. I hadn't planned for anything to go wrong. It was just me and the wild, ready for an adventure. I had decided to go camping alone. Sure, it was a bit of a last-minute decision, but I had a few days off and needed a break from the city. I had been in the mountains before, but this time, I wanted to explore a more remote area, far from the usual trails where tourists and weekend campers went. I found a small, tucked-away spot near a creek. The area felt peaceful and isolated, just the kind of place to recharge. The night before, I had set up camp near the creek. I made sure everything was secure. Tent staked down tight, backpack tucked under a tree for safety, and firewood stacked in a pile. I always loved the ritual of camping. The setting up, the making of the fire, the simplicity of it all. It gave me a sense of calm I couldn't quite explain. It was just me, the trees, and the sound of the creek. I sat up in the tent, rubbing my eyes as I took in the serenity of the morning. I could hear the faint gurgle of the creek nearby and the distant chirping of birds. The smell of pine was thick in the air, the scent so fresh it almost felt like I could taste it. It was still early, so there was a chill in the air, but it wasn't unbearable. I quickly threw on my jacket, grabbed my boots, and stepped outside to start the fire. The logs had cooled from the night before, but they were still good for kindling. I managed to get it going quickly, the warm flames licking at the cool morning air. While the fire crackled, I boiled some water for coffee. I had my simple setup, a small camping stove, a metal pot, and a few packs of instant coffee. As the water heated up, I gazed out over the campsite. It was secluded, which is exactly what I wanted. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional splash from the creek. After finishing my coffee, I decided to take a quick hike to stretch my legs. I wasn't going too far, just a little jaunt to see what was beyond the ridge. I had no particular plan, but that was the beauty of hiking alone. You didn't need a plan. It was just you and the land, and whatever adventure unfolded. The trail was narrow at first, the forest dense with tall pines and thick underbrush. I made my way slowly, enjoying the quiet. There's something special about the stillness of nature that you don't quite get anywhere else. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I was used to hiking, but this place felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, almost suffocating. I walked for about an hour, just taking in the surroundings. The trees seemed to grow taller as I moved deeper into the forest. The underbrush got thicker and the path less defined. Eventually, I came to a small clearing where I stopped to take a break. There, I noticed something odd, a series of markings on the trees. At first, I thought they might be from animals or maybe some old trail markers, but something about them seemed off. The cuts on the trees were too deliberate. They weren't random scratches from wildlife. They were methodical, almost like someone had carved them deliberately. I took a closer look at the markings. There were 3 tall trees, each marked with deep, angular cuts. The cuts were in the shape of a triangle, and there were other strange symbols carved underneath them. They weren't anything I recognized, and that made me uneasy. I had seen symbols before in my travels, trail markers, old Native American carvings, things like that. But this was different. This felt deliberate, like someone had left a message. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure why, but the air felt suddenly colder, the forest unnervingly still. I spent a few more minutes staring at the markings, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest had gone eerily quiet, and I could feel a weight in the air, as though something was watching me. I decided to turn back. The hike had been nice, but I wasn't sure I wanted to press my luck further into the woods. I retraced my steps, keeping my eyes on the ground to avoid tripping over the rocks and uneven terrain. The path back seemed longer than before, the shadows of the trees stretching further across the ground. It was around this time that I started to hear it, the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the crunching of leaves underfoot, a trick of the wind. But then, I heard it again, more distinct this time. Footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears to listen. The sound stopped too. I took a cautious step forward, but the footsteps resumed, just a little farther away. I turned around, but the forest behind me was still and silent. I could feel my heart beating faster. I knew no one else was supposed to be here, at least not for miles. I had made sure to check the map and even called ahead to make sure the area was free of other campers. Yet here I was, hearing footsteps in the woods, with no one in sight. I quickened my pace, the footsteps growing louder as I moved. My breathing became heavier as I pushed myself harder through the thickening forest. The footsteps followed, never too close but always there, just far enough to keep me tense and on edge. I felt like I was being hunted, though I couldn't figure out by what. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I turned again to see if anyone, or anything, was behind me. Nothing, just the forest, as silent as ever. The footsteps had stopped again. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was the wind, playing tricks on me. But the uneasy feeling that had crept into my gut told me it wasn't anything so simple. I hurried back to camp, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. By the time I reached the camp, the sun was high in the sky, but it still felt strange. Like something was off, though I couldn't pinpoint what. I quickly checked my surroundings, making sure everything was still in place. The fire had died down, and the tent was exactly where I'd left it. I felt a little ridiculous, but the thought that someone else had been near my camp, or worse, had been following me, wouldn't leave me. I spent the rest of the afternoon making lunch and keeping busy. I packed everything carefully, checked the map again, and made a mental note to leave the area the next morning. Something about this place wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I made sure the fire was blazing high, and I kept the light on. I didn't care how paranoid it seemed. I felt safer with the campfire burning, its light flickering in the dark. I lay in my tent, listening to the crackle of the fire, my mind racing. It was then that I heard something again, the sound of footsteps, this time closer. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were in front of me, just outside the edge of the firelight. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. They stopped, and then they started again, closer. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. In a panic, I grabbed my things, stuffing everything into my backpack without thinking. I didn't care about organizing or packing things carefully. I just needed to leave. I quickly unzipped the tent, ready to bolt, when I froze again. There, just outside the ring of firelight, standing perfectly still, was a man. Tall, with a rough, weathered face. He didn't say anything, didn't move a muscle, just stood there, staring at me with cold eyes. His clothes were dirty, and his hands were out of sight. My stomach twisted into knots. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran into the woods, not looking back. I ran as fast as I could, pushing through the trees, tripping over roots and rocks. I didn't care anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The footsteps behind me were louder now, closer, but they stopped. When I finally reached the road at the edge of the forest, I collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air. I looked back toward the forest, but all was still.
No footsteps, no shadows.
In the morning, I called for help, explaining the situation. Authorities investigated, but they found nothing. No signs of anyone else being there. No trace of anyone having followed me. Just the wilderness, empty and quiet. I never went back to that spot, and I don't think I ever will. The forest, that place, holds something I can't explain. Something that still haunts me. I'm just glad I made it out. It was one of those days when everything felt just right. The weather was clear, and the air had that crispness that only comes with the early spring. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks, and I was excited to finally get out into the wilderness. I needed the peace and quiet, a break from the constant buzz of the city. The idea of being out there, alone with just the trees and the sounds of nature, felt like exactly what I needed. I drove up to a small, isolated campsite that I had researched. It was tucked away in the woods, far from the nearest road or town. The kind of place where you could disappear for a few days without worrying about anything. I had my gear packed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a small stove, and I was ready for the adventure. The forest around me was thick and quiet as I set up my camp. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. I found a perfect spot near a small stream. It had a good view of the woods and was sheltered by a few large trees that would offer some protection from the wind. As I worked on setting up my tent, I couldn't help but appreciate how peaceful it was. I had all the time in the world, and there was nothing I had to do except enjoy the silence. Once my camp was set up, I decided to go for a short hike. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the landscape. The trail started just beyond my campsite, winding deeper into the forest. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it. The air was still, and the trees seemed to be watching me as I walked deeper into the woods. I knew I wasn't in any danger. I had done enough hiking to feel confident in these kinds of surroundings. The further I went, the more I felt like I was the only person on Earth. After about an hour of hiking, I stopped to take a break near a clearing. I sat on a large rock, taking in the view. The sun was now lower in the sky, and the forest had taken on a more somber tone. The shadows from the trees grew longer, and the silence seemed more intense. I wasn't nervous, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the wind had picked up, or how the forest seemed to hold its breath. The peaceful feeling I had earlier started to fade, replaced by a slight unease. I brushed it off as nothing more than the natural feeling you get when you're alone in the woods. I decided it was time to head back to camp. The sky was starting to darken, and I didn't want to be out here when it was completely dark. As I retraced my steps, I started to feel that unease again. It was strange. I was still in familiar territory, yet the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, once majestic, now felt oppressive, their branches twisting in strange shapes in the fading light. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had nearly set. I hurried back to my campsite, eager to get a fire going and relax. But as I approached my camp, I noticed something odd. My tent was a little off-center. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was enough to make me pause. I hadn't noticed anything strange when I left, but now it felt like something had been moved. I shrugged it off. It was probably just the wind, or maybe I hadn't staked it down properly. After all, I had been in a rush to get to the trail. I started a fire, the crackling flames helping to settle my nerves. The warmth of the fire felt good against the growing chill of the evening. I cooked some food and ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. It felt so peaceful, almost like everything was as it should be. But then, just as I was finishing my meal, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a twig snapping in the distance. I froze, straining to listen. The fire crackled, and the night was suddenly much quieter. I didn't hear it again for a while, and I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The forest is full of creatures, after all. I went to bed shortly after, trying to shake the unease from my mind. The night passed uneventfully, or at least it seemed so at first. I woke up around 3 a.m., the moon casting a pale light through the trees. I could hear the sound of the wind, but there was something else now, a faint rustling, like something moving just outside the perimeter of my campsite. I held my breath, listening intently, but it stopped as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a small animal or the wind playing tricks, but the rest of the night was restless. I kept hearing faint sounds, like footsteps just outside the circle of light from the campfire. Each time I would get up and check, but there was never anything there. It was maddening. My nerves were on edge, and I didn't feel safe. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When morning came, I was exhausted. I was relieved that I had made it through the night, but I still felt on edge. The air had changed again. It was heavier now, and the forest around me seemed more ominous, like it was watching me. I packed up my camp, eager to leave and put the whole experience behind me. I had had enough of the isolation. It felt like the forest itself was trying to hold me there, to keep me from leaving. As I loaded my gear into my truck, I couldn't help but glance back toward the trees. I felt like something was still there, lurking just out of sight. It wasn't until I started the engine and began driving away that I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The further I got from that place, the better I felt. The drive home was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I got back to my apartment, I unpacked my things, my hands trembling a little. I hadn't realized just how shaken I was until I was back in the safety of my own space. I kept thinking about that feeling in the woods, the sense that I wasn't alone, even when there was no one around. It wasn't until a few days later that I got the full picture. I was going through my camera, checking the pictures I had taken during the hike, when I noticed something strange in one of them. It was a photo of the clearing where I had stopped for a break. In the background, near the trees, there was a figure. It was barely visible, just a silhouette, but it was unmistakable. Someone had been out there watching me, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I hadn't been alone in the woods. I don't know who it was or why they were there, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't imagining it. I don't know what their intentions were, but I'm grateful that nothing happened while I was there. I don't plan on returning to that campsite again. I've learned my lesson. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some things are better left unseen. The image still haunts me. I don't know if it was just someone else camping nearby, or if it was something more sinister. Either way, I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, of knowing I wasn't truly alone in the woods. And I'll never forget how quickly the forest, once so beautiful, can turn into something much darker. I had been looking forward to the camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to escape the noise of city life and reconnect with nature. I'd never been on a solo camping trip before, but something about being alone in the woods sounded incredibly appealing. So, I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, and the bare essentials, and set off on a Friday afternoon to a remote campsite deep in the woods. The drive out was longer than I had anticipated. It was a bit of a winding road, cutting through dense forest with barely any signs of civilization. I passed a few small towns, but they were so far apart that it made me realize just how isolated I would be. When I finally arrived at the campsite, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip, casting a golden hue over the trees. I had planned to set up my tent and get settled before dark, but I quickly realized that the site was more rugged than I had expected. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the unsettling kind. There were no birds singing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was almost like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I shrugged it off as just part of the wilderness, maybe a sign that I had arrived during a quiet time of the year. The campsite wasn't much, just a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick undergrowth. There was a fire pit in the center, surrounded by a few logs that looked like they'd been there for ages. A few discarded beer cans lay at the edge of the clearing, which made me think that maybe this place wasn't as isolated as it seemed, or perhaps it was frequented by people who weren't too respectful of the environment. I decided to set up my tent near the fire pit. The ground was uneven and covered in roots, but I managed to find a flat spot. As I began assembling the tent, I realized I hadn't thought about food. I had packed enough for a simple dinner, instant noodles and a few snacks, but I forgot to bring a proper stove, so I had to make do with the campfire. I gathered some dry wood and tried to start a fire, but the dampness of the surrounding trees made it harder than I expected. It took almost an hour before I had a decent flame going. The evening passed slowly. I ate my noodles, made some tea, and sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. It was peaceful in an eerie way, like the forest was waiting for something. The air had that sharp, fresh scent of pine mixed with earth, but there was a thickness to it, almost like something was off. Still, I was enjoying the solitude, even if it felt a little too still. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and I retreated into my tent. The warmth from the fire outside didn't quite reach inside, and I zipped myself into my sleeping bag for the night. I tried to fall asleep, but something about the silence kept me awake. The kind of silence that's so deep, it feels like the world is holding its breath. Around midnight, I was still wide awake, staring at the walls of my tent. That's when I heard it, the sound of a twig snapping in the distance. It was faint but distinct. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening. The woods were still again. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But then, I heard it again, a soft rustling, like something large moving through the underbrush. It was too deliberate to be an animal. I lay there, straining to hear. The noise was coming from the direction of the trees behind my tent, just out of sight. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I told myself to stay calm. There was no reason to panic. I was alone, but I had the means to defend myself if needed. Still, the thought of something or someone lurking nearby unsettled me. The sounds continued, but now they were closer. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I sat up in my tent, my breath shallow. My mind raced, trying to think through what to do. The first thing that came to mind was to grab my flashlight, but I hesitated. What if whoever or whatever it was knew I was awake? What if shining a light out there would just make things worse? I decided to stay still, hoping the sounds would stop. But they didn't. The footsteps came closer and closer, and I could hear the unmistakable crunch of dry leaves underfoot. My skin prickled with a growing sense of dread. I realized I wasn't alone, and that fact made my blood run cold. It was then that I heard a low, guttural growl, not from an animal, but from something more human-like. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't understand what I was hearing. Maybe it was a person, but the sound felt wrong. The growl sent shivers down my spine. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront it? Should I run? I didn't want to risk being seen, so I stayed silent, my breath barely escaping my mouth. The growling continued for what felt like an eternity. It was getting closer to the tent. I could hear the rustling of the leaves right outside the thin fabric, and my mind raced with images of what could be out there. I grabbed the small knife I'd packed, holding it tightly in my hand, my knuckles white from the pressure. The sound stopped suddenly. Complete silence. I don't know how long I sat there, listening intently for any movement. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stretch indefinitely. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, and the dark seemed even darker. Then, just when I thought it might be safe to move, I heard it again. But this time it was a voice, a soft whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. I couldn't tell what it was saying, but the tone of it made my stomach churn. It sounded wrong. I held my breath, listening, trying to calm myself. Whatever it was, it hadn't left. I had no idea what kind of person or animal I was dealing with, but I had to make it through the night. I couldn't leave my tent and risk encountering it in the open. If I stayed hidden, maybe it would move on. I just had to wait. The night dragged on. Every small sound seemed amplified in the silence. Twigs snapping, leaves shifting, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. But after what felt like hours, the sounds slowly faded. The growling, the whispering, it all stopped. I stayed perfectly still for a while, just listening. I wasn't sure if it had gone or if I was just too afraid to move. When I finally felt brave enough to peek outside, I unzipped the door of the tent just a fraction. I didn't see anything. The woods were still, but my sense of unease hadn't lifted. There was no sign of the figure or the noises I had heard, but I knew something was out there, something I couldn't explain. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely sleeping. The hours stretched on in an agonizing crawl. By morning, I was exhausted, physically drained from fear and lack of sleep. The sun rose, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange. The birds finally began to sing again, and the woods started to feel alive once more. But the peace of the morning didn't erase the terror of the night. I packed up my camp quickly, not bothering to cook breakfast or take a leisurely hike. The idea of staying there any longer felt wrong. When I finally made my way back to the car, the sense of relief was almost overwhelming. I had made it through the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something that had been too close for comfort. I drove home that morning, not looking back once. The campsite, the woods, the sounds. It all felt like a distant nightmare now. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that place. Whatever I had experienced out there, I wasn't willing to risk encountering it again. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. They wouldn't believe me, and maybe I wouldn't believe it either if it hadn't happened to me. But every time I pass through that part of the woods, I can't help but wonder if something is still out there, waiting. And that thought, no matter how irrational, sticks with me to this day. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon as I set up my tent by the lake. It had been a long, exhausting hike to this spot, but I was finally here. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for weeks, needing the time away from everything. The trees surrounding the area were dense, thick with the scent of pine, and the sound of the lake gently lapping at the shore added to the peacefulness of the moment. The cool evening breeze felt good against my skin, and I was already starting to relax. I unpacked my gear, setting up camp with the methodical precision I had learned over the years of hiking and camping. The firewood I had gathered earlier was now piled neatly, ready for the fire. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs. It was quiet, too quiet maybe. As I bent down to light the fire, I noticed the faintest rustling in the trees behind me. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of that. It was too rhythmic. I paused, holding the match to the kindling in my hand, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a deer moving through the underbrush. But something about it felt off. It wasn't normal. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I struck the match and lit the kindling. The fire quickly caught, crackling as the flames rose up, casting flickering shadows around the campsite. I pulled my camping chair closer to the fire and sat down, feeling the warmth as I pulled my jacket tighter around me. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach didn't go away. The rustling in the trees had stopped, but it had left me unsettled. My instincts were telling me something wasn't right. Maybe it was just the isolation, maybe it was the hours of solitude, but my senses were on high alert. The fire crackled, the shadows danced, and the sound of the wind began to pick up again. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling lingered. Night came quickly, and with it, the cold. The fire flickered, but the warmth didn't seem to cut through the chill in the air. I tried to distract myself by eating, but my mind kept wandering back to the rustling sound. It wasn't just a normal animal. It felt deliberate, like something or someone was moving with purpose, watching. As the fire began to die down, I decided to get into the tent for the night. I zipped myself inside, pulling the sleeping bag around me. I could hear the night noises, crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of a creature moving through the woods, but it felt different now. The sounds weren't soothing. They were unnerving, amplified by the stillness around me. The small lantern I had hung inside the tent cast a soft, warm glow, but it did little to ease the tension building in my chest. My breathing slowed as I lay there, eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. And then I heard it again, a soft rustling, just outside the tent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced. It wasn't a breeze this time. It was more deliberate. Someone or something was definitely out there. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rustling continued, slow and measured, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was. I had always known that being alone in the woods could be dangerous, but this felt different. It wasn't just the isolation that scared me. It was the feeling that I was being watched, observed. My instincts screamed at me to get up, to do something, but I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The rustling stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, purposeful, moved closer to the tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves beneath each step. My heart raced faster, my thoughts scrambling for a plan. Should I confront whoever it was? Should I call out? Or should I just stay quiet and hope they went away? Before I could decide, the footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I didn't dare move. My entire body was stiff with fear. I wanted to look out the tent's opening, but I knew that would make me an easy target. I told myself it was probably just another hiker, but something deep down told me that wasn't the case. I waited and waited. The steps didn't come again. The rustling resumed, but this time it was different. It wasn't the sound of someone walking. It was the sound of something, or someone, circling the tent. I could hear the crunching of leaves, the shifting of dirt, and the sound of branches scraping against the fabric. It was like whatever it was testing my response, seeing if I would make a move. I wasn't sure how long it went on. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stretch. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every sound outside the tent felt amplified, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, thumping louder than any of the sounds around me. Finally, the rustling stopped again. Complete silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was a suffocating, waiting silence. My mind raced, my body rigid with fear. I didn't sleep that night. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, and every creak of the tent, every rustle of a nearby tree, made me jump. The night felt like it would never end. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't realized I was holding on to. The night was over, but I didn't feel safe. I felt exposed. I lay in the tent for a while, trying to gather the courage to get up and face the outside world. What had happened? Was it just my imagination running wild? Or had I been truly watched? The logical part of my brain told me it was just a coincidence, but the fear I felt was real. There was something out there, something that had been circling my tent, something that had known I was alone. Finally, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the fresh morning air filling my lungs. The forest looked calm now, the sunlight filtering through the trees. But as I looked around, I noticed something. The area around my camp, where I had gathered firewood the day before, was disturbed. The branches I had left lying on the ground were scattered, as if someone or something had been rooting through them. The footprints were large, heavy, and not like any animal tracks I recognized. My heart sank. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever or whatever had been circling my tent wasn't just passing by. They had been looking for something. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, the eerie silence of the forest pressing in on me. I didn't stop to take any pictures, didn't stop to savor the morning air. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt longer than the one coming in, every snap of a twig underfoot making my heart skip a beat. My senses were on high alert, every rustle in the trees making me stop and look over my shoulder. It took hours, but I finally made it to the parking lot, where my car was waiting. I felt a rush of relief as I reached it, the safety of the vehicle offering a sense of comfort I hadn't realized I needed so badly. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and drove away, not once looking back at the woods. As I made my way home, I couldn't help but think about what had happened. The rustling, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. It had all been too real to ignore. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but one thing was clear. I wouldn't be going back to that lake again. Not for a long time, maybe never. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something that terrified me even more than the night itself. I wasn't alone on that trail when I hiked in, and I might not have been alone on my way out either. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, a quick getaway into the woods to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. I had always been a fan of nature. Something about being surrounded by trees, the quiet hum of the forest, and the crisp air made me feel at ease. It was just me, my backpack, and the tent I had bought last year. I had planned this trip for weeks, picking the perfect spot on the map far enough from any trail to guarantee privacy, but not too far that it would be difficult to get back if anything went wrong. I arrived at the campsite around noon, after a couple of hours driving down narrow, winding roads. There were a few cars scattered in the parking area at the trailhead, but it was nothing like the crowded, popular campgrounds I usually tried to avoid. I was looking for solitude, and I was certain I had found it. The air smelled fresh, the trees towering above me, their branches whispering in the wind. I made my way to the spot I had marked on my map. The terrain was rough, with rocks and uneven ground, but it didn't bother me. I liked the challenge of finding the perfect place to set up my tent, away from the beaten path. It wasn't long before I came across a small clearing, just big enough for my tent, with a stream running nearby. The sound of water trickling over rocks was soothing, and I could already feel the stress from my regular life slipping away. I spent the next few hours setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and preparing for the night ahead. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. I built a small fire pit and laid out my camp gear, preparing myself for a quiet night under the stars. I wasn't expecting any excitement. I just wanted to relax. As the fire crackled to life, I sat back on the log I had dragged over to use as a seat and watched the flames dance. The night was cold, but not unbearable. I had packed plenty of warm clothes and a thick sleeping bag. Everything was perfect. It wasn't until after dark that I started to feel uneasy. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation. There's something about being alone in the woods that, no matter how peaceful it seems, can make the mind play tricks. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me tense up, but I told myself it was just animals going about their business. Still, the feeling lingered, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I shrugged it off and focused on the fire, tossing another log into the flames. The warmth was comforting, and I felt my shoulders relax. But then, just as I was about to get up to fetch more firewood, I heard a sound. A faint crunching of leaves, like something was moving through the underbrush, but not in the typical way of an animal. It was too deliberate, almost like someone was trying to be quiet, but wasn't succeeding. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that it was another camper, maybe someone who had gotten lost or was looking for firewood. But the longer I listened, the more I began to doubt that explanation. The sound wasn't coming from the direction of the trail, but deeper in the woods, where there shouldn't be anyone. I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow, trying to hear more clearly. The noise continued for a few minutes, moving closer, then stopping abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't return. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was almost too human. My mind started to race. I knew that there were no other campsites nearby, and I had taken a route that most people wouldn't have bothered with. So who could it be? I wasn't sure if I should pack up and leave. It was late, and the forest would be pitch black in no time. But the feeling in my gut told me that staying here, alone, in the dark, wasn't a good idea. I decided to ignore the feeling. I told myself it was probably just my mind playing tricks. I had been out in nature plenty of times before and had never felt unsafe. I wasn't about to let a noise in the woods freak me out. I threw another log on the fire and stood up, ready to go fetch more wood. But as I turned, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure. It was barely visible through the trees, but I definitely saw it. A tall shadow standing still, just watching me. My heart nearly stopped. The figure didn't move at first. I stood there, completely frozen, my body stiff with fear. I wanted to call out, ask if they needed help, but the words wouldn't come. I had never been more terrified in my life. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally moved, slipping silently back into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where it went. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and bolted to the tent. I threw the door open, scrambled inside, and zipped it shut, locking myself in. My breath came in short gasps, my mind racing with questions. Who was that? What did they want? I lay in the dark, trying to calm myself, but the fear wouldn't leave. I kept hearing sounds outside the tent. Faint footsteps, the crunch of leaves, something brushing against the sides of the tent. Every few minutes, I would peek outside with my flashlight, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the dark, silent woods surrounding me. The hours dragged on like this. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But my instincts screamed that something was wrong. The figure in the woods wasn't just some random person. Whoever they were deliberately staying out of sight, watching me. Couldn't sleep. The night stretched on, every second feeling like a lifetime. I couldn't help but think about the possibilities. Maybe it was someone just passing through. Maybe they were just curious. But my gut told me otherwise. Something about the way they moved, the way they stayed hidden, it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was being hunted. As the hours passed, the fire outside burned low. The cold seeped into the tent, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The sounds outside seemed to get closer, more frequent, and I could feel my anxiety growing with every rustle in the leaves. At one point, I heard something heavy fall to the ground outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps. I wasn't sure if I could take it anymore. I had to do something, anything, to get out of that situation. I grabbed my backpack, opened the zipper, and pulled out my map. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. But the route back to the car was long, and it would be a dangerous hike in the dark, especially with whatever or whoever was out there. I took a deep breath and thought about it. It was my only option. I needed to make it to the trailhead, back to the car where I would be safe. I packed up my things as quietly as I could, making sure not to alert whoever was out there that I was leaving. I moved quickly, but carefully, trying not to make any noise as I stuffed everything into my backpack. When I was done, I opened the tent door just a crack, peering outside. There was no movement, no shadow in the trees. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe I was just scared for no reason. But I didn't hesitate. I stepped out of the tent, careful not to make a sound, and began walking toward the trailhead. I kept my eyes on the ground, making sure not to trip over any roots or rocks. The darkness was thick, and the only light came from the weak beam of my flashlight. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with every step. I was halfway to the trail when I heard it again, soft footsteps behind me, slowly, almost as if they were testing the ground, trying to stay quiet. I couldn't take it anymore. I started running. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could, ignoring the sharp branches that scraped at my face, the rocks that nearly tripped me. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was gasping for breath. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I made it to my car, threw my backpack in the back seat, and drove away. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by the lights of the town. I never went back to that campsite, and I never will. The fear I felt that night was something I can't explain, but I know one thing for sure. I was never truly alone in the woods that night. I've been going camping since I was a kid, but this trip was different. There was something about this particular trip that made me uneasy, though I didn't know exactly what. I'd gone camping with a few friends, and we'd chosen a spot deep in the woods, far away from the usual campgrounds. It wasn't the first time we'd camped off the beaten path, but the dense forest around us felt more isolating, more silent. We arrived late in the afternoon, right as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The drive had been long, with the last stretch down a bumpy dirt road that felt more and more like we were heading into the unknown. When we finally reached the spot, there was no sign of other campers. The place was deserted. For some reason, that felt comforting at first. The air was fresh and crisp, the kind of clean air you can only get deep in the forest. The scent of pine and earth filled my lungs, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. We set up camp quickly. My friends were used to this, assembling tents, unloading supplies, and gathering firewood. I went off to collect some more firewood from the surrounding woods, just a few meters from the campsite, trying to distract myself from the odd feeling I had in the pit of my stomach. There was nothing particularly unsettling about the place, but as I picked up the fallen branches, I couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't right. It was like I was being watched, but when I turned around, nothing was there. After a while, I returned to the campfire. The sun had almost completely set, and the shadows of the trees were long and dark, stretching like fingers across the forest floor. We ate dinner, roasted marshmallows, and talked, though the usual excitement and laughter didn't come as easily as it usually did. I couldn't place it, but the air felt heavy, like something was holding its breath. That night, we sat around the fire, listening to the crackling flames. There was no sound of wildlife, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, no owls hooting in the distance, just silence. It was eerie, unsettling. I tried to ignore it and focus on the warmth of the fire, but the silence felt too loud, too suffocating. We stayed up late, talking and telling stories, but as the fire burned down to embers, we eventually turned in. My friends crawled into their tents, and I was left alone by the fire for a moment, staring into the dying flames. I couldn't help but glance around at the trees, which seemed to loom taller and darker now. The wind had died down, leaving the air still. My heart raced a little as I turned to head toward my tent, but something stopped me. There was a sound, a crack, came from deeper in the woods. Not a branch breaking, not the sound of an animal moving. It was a sharp crack, like something heavy had fallen, but it didn't make the usual noise. It was strange, out of place. I froze, trying to listen again, but there was nothing, just the night. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my imagination. Still, I hurried into my tent and zipped it up tightly, trying to settle into my sleeping bag. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but the sound kept echoing in my head. Around midnight, I woke up to the feeling of something off. The night had grown even quieter. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I tossed and turned, listening to every little rustle and creak around me, but nothing seemed right. I had no idea how much time passed when I heard it again. A low, guttural sound, almost like a grunt. It was faint at first, so quiet that I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. It was closer. My heart started to race, and I held my breath, straining to listen. It was coming from the woods. It sounded like something large was moving through the trees. A bear, maybe? No, this sound was different, more deliberate, more unnatural. I was paralyzed with fear. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I didn't want to wake my friends. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I couldn't ignore it. Whatever it was out there, moving closer. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I lay there in the darkness, the cold air seeping into my tent. I couldn't hear anything, not even the usual forest sounds. My thoughts were racing. Should I wake up my friends? Should I leave the tent? What if it was dangerous? I reached for my phone, but the battery was almost dead. I tried to stay as quiet as possible, barely breathing, just listening. And then I heard it, a snap, a twig breaking, not far from my tent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent carefully, and poked my head out, shining the beam of light into the trees. Nothing, just the shadows of the forest. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the woods. My pulse was pounding in my ears. The air felt heavy with tension, and the darkness seemed to stretch forever. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I moved slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping through the trees, trying to find something, anything, that would explain the sounds. Then, as the beam of light moved across the ground, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a footprint, not a human footprint, but a large one. A deep, heavy print like something much bigger than a person had passed through. It was too large to be a bear, too wide. And the ground around it was disturbed, like something had been dragging itself through the dirt. I stepped back, my heart racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was something off about it, something wrong. I felt a chill run through me as I looked deeper into the woods, where the trees were even darker, almost like they were closing in on me. I backed up slowly, retreating to my tent. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. The others were asleep, unaware of what was happening, and I didn't want to alarm them, but I didn't want to be alone either. I decided to wake them up. I needed them to know what was going on, and I wasn't going to be able to sleep through this. I unzipped my tent again and crept over to my friends' tents. They were still asleep, but I couldn't just wait anymore. I shook them awake, trying to be as quiet as possible. They groggily stirred, confused by my urgency, but I could see the fear in their eyes when I told them what I had heard. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, listening to the woods around us. The sounds of the forest had returned, but there was still a strange tension in the air. Something felt off. Something was wrong. We didn't sleep that night. We huddled together by the fire, keeping a watchful eye on the woods. No one spoke much, but we all felt it. The heavy presence that seemed to be watching us from the shadows. As dawn broke, the feeling slowly faded. The forest was still calm. The night had passed, but the memory of it lingered. We packed up our campsite in silence, not wanting to stay any longer than we had to. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods. The sun was shining now, and everything looked normal, peaceful even. But I knew that something was out there. Something had been watching us. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, and I didn't know if I would ever feel safe camping again. That trip didn't just end with us leaving the woods. It ended with a question that lingered long after we were back in civilization. What was out there, and why had it been watching us? Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. I could feel the weight of the backpack pressing against my shoulders as I trudged along the trail. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the forest seemed to hum with an eerie stillness, the kind of quiet you only get when you're deep into the woods. My boots crunched over the fallen leaves, and every so often, a twig would snap underfoot, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet surroundings. I'd been planning this trip for months, just a weekend getaway to clear my head, escape the city. It had been a long, exhausting few months, and the idea of spending some time in the wilderness, away from all the noise, felt like the perfect way to reset. I'd chosen a remote campsite, one that was far from any hiking paths or populated areas. The perfect spot, or so I thought. I wasn't exactly an expert camper, but I'd done my research. I knew how to set up a tent, start a fire, and cook over an open flame. The basics, anyway. But I was alone, and I quickly realized that being alone in the woods felt different than I'd expected. It wasn't just peaceful, like I'd imagined. There was a certain unease that seemed to settle in as the daylight began to fade. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees as I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. The place looked perfect, a small patch of flat ground surrounded by tall trees, with a view of a gently flowing stream off to one side. The sound of the water was soothing, but there was something about the way the shadows shifted in the trees that made me uneasy. I shook it off. I wasn't going to let my mind play tricks on me. It was just the wilderness. I set up my tent quickly, rolling out my sleeping bag and laying out my gear. The fire pit was already prepared, and I had enough firewood to last me the night. I went about starting the fire, my hands moving on autopilot, but all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was a feeling I couldn't put into words, just a deep, gnawing sense of discomfort that grew with every passing minute. By the time the fire was crackling in front of me, the last remnants of daylight had vanished, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The only light came from the flickering fire, casting long shadows that danced and twisted on the ground. I sat close to the fire, warming my hands, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. I ate a simple dinner, some jerky and a granola bar, and drank some water, but I couldn't seem to focus on anything. My mind kept drifting to the sounds around me, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance, the chirping of crickets, but there was something off about it. It wasn't just the typical forest noises. It felt like something was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. As the night wore on, I decided to turn in. I wasn't tired, but I figured a good night's sleep would do me some good. The cold air nipped at my skin as I crawled into my tent and zipped it up. The sound of the fire crackling outside was comforting, but the wind seemed to be picking up, and with it came a new noise, a low, distant thudding sound. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the usual rustling of animals. It was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an animal moving through the woods, maybe a deer or a bear. But the thudding continued, growing closer and louder. My heart started to race as I lay in the darkness, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. The thudding stopped, and for a moment, the woods fell completely silent. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, scanning the dark forest for any sign of movement. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the fire flickering weakly in the distance. I told myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but a nagging feeling still lingered in the pit of my stomach. I lay back down, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, something rustling in the underbrush, but whenever I looked out, there was nothing there. The wind had picked up, too, howling through the trees, but still, it wasn't the wind that was bothering me. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. Then it happened. A sharp, sudden crash echoed through the woods, followed by a low growl. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move at first. I didn't know what to do. The growl was deep and guttural, and it sent a chill down my spine. Something was out there, something big. I could hear it moving, circling my camp, just out of sight. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The growling stopped, replaced by a soft, eerie scratching sound, like claws dragging along bark. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, the noise seeming to come from all around me. I needed to leave. Now, I quickly packed up what little I had left outside and shoved it into my backpack. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop now. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I didn't want to find out. The scratching sound continued, moving closer to my tent. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my tent, threw it over my shoulder, and sprinted for the trail. The woods around me were dark and suffocating, the trees closing in as I ran. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled several times, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Behind me, I could still hear the growl, now louder, closer. Something was chasing me. I didn't know how long I ran. My legs burned. My chest felt like it was going to explode, but I couldn't stop. My flashlight flickered and then went out entirely. I was in total darkness now, but I didn't slow down. I kept running, trying to follow the trail by memory, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. The faintest sliver of light in the distance. The edge of the forest. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming for rest, but I didn't dare stop. The light grew brighter as I neared it, and with one final burst of energy, I broke through the tree line. I stumbled out into the open, into the small parking area where I had left my car. I was breathless, drenched in sweat, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my keys. The forest behind me was still dark and silent. The growling had stopped, but I didn't dare look back. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and drove as fast as I could, not caring about the road or the speed limit. I just needed to get away. It wasn't until I was safely out of the woods, the trees long gone behind me, that I could breathe again. I don't know what I heard that night or what chased me through the forest. I don't know if it was a wild animal, a person, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. And I'll never forget the way the woods felt that night. They were alive, and something in them was watching. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Just me, a tent, and the mountains. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks, hoping to escape the noise of the city and disconnect for a bit. I had done this many times before, hiking through rough terrain, setting up camp, cooking over a fire, and sleeping under the stars. This time was supposed to be no different. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few days of peace and quiet. But that's not how things turned out. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The air had a slight chill to it, the kind that you only get in the early evenings of fall. I parked my truck, grabbed my backpack, and started the hike up to the campsite. The trail was familiar to me, having hiked it once or twice before, but tonight it felt different. Maybe it was the solitude, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the lack of daylight. The path was mostly downhill for the first mile, through thick woods with towering trees that blocked out the last light of day. There was a soft crunch of leaves underfoot, and the occasional rustle of a creature moving through the underbrush. I felt calm. This was my kind of place. I was used to this, and the quiet was soothing. After about an hour of walking, I reached a clearing where I planned to set up camp. The area was perfect, surrounded by trees, with a small stream running through one side. I knew this spot well. I had camped here before. The ground was soft and flat, perfect for pitching my tent. The fire pit was already in place, and the dry wood from previous campers made it easy to start a fire. Everything was as it should be. I set up my tent and got a small fire going. The flames flickered and crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the campsite. The sound of the stream nearby was soothing, a constant gentle rush of water. I made some food, not much, just a simple meal of beans and rice. It wasn't fancy, but it filled me up. I sat by the fire, eating, listening to the night sounds. The wind rustled the trees, and every now and then, I heard the call of an owl in the distance. As the night wore on, I began to feel that sense of isolation that only deep woods can give you. The kind where every sound, no matter how small, seems magnified. The occasional crack of a twig or the flutter of leaves in the wind took on a new significance. But it was nothing, just nature doing its thing. Eventually, the fire died down, and I decided to crawl into my tent. I was tired from the hike, and the warmth of my sleeping bag felt good after the chilly evening air. I zipped myself into the tent and lay there, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the night. It wasn't long before I heard something strange. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was something else. A thud, soft but distinct, like something heavy falling to the ground. I froze, holding my breath. Another thud. It was coming from the woods. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. This was different. I had been camping long enough to know what animals sounded like in the woods. This wasn't an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. I peered out into the darkness, but all I could see were shadows. The fire had long since gone out, and the night was now completely black. I strained my ears, trying to hear if anything moved. It was dead silent. No wind, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Then I heard it again, a thud, closer this time. My heart started to race. I had no idea what it was, but I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals didn't make sounds like that, and they didn't move in the woods this late at night. My first thought was maybe someone else was out there, another camper, maybe. But why would anyone be out here in the dark, making those sounds? I hesitated for a long moment, unsure what to do. My mind raced, and I felt a cold sweat beginning to form on my forehead. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't just leave either, not without knowing what was going on. I decided to grab my things and make my way back down the trail. But as I reached for the zipper to my tent, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. The sound wasn't a thud this time. It was a dragging noise, slow and deliberate. It was coming from just beyond the tree-line. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Someone or something was out there. I could feel their presence. My breathing became shallow, and I tried to steady myself. But my mind was screaming at me to leave, to run. But I didn't. Instead, I waited, and after what seemed like an eternity, the dragging noise stopped. And then nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with what I could, and shoved the rest of my gear into the tent. I wasn't going to pack everything up. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. But as I stood there, about to zip up the tent and run, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, low and raspy, but unmistakable. It wasn't words, not really. More like a low growl, a whisper in the dark. It was so faint I almost didn't hear it, but it was there. I froze, my blood going cold in my veins. Whoever or whatever was out there, they knew I was here. I grabbed my flashlight and hurriedly made my way down the trail, walking as fast as I could without running. My mind raced, and my heart pounded in my chest. I kept thinking that I could hear something following me, just beyond the trees. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. By the time I reached the end of the trail, I was exhausted. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I knew I had to keep going. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears, and the only light was from the flashlight, which was starting to flicker as the battery drained. I didn't stop. I just kept walking, further and further from the campsite. My legs burned, and my mind kept playing tricks on me, hearing sounds in the dark that weren't there. I couldn't help but feel like something was still behind me, following me, even though I never saw anything. When I finally reached my truck, I couldn't believe it. I was so relieved to see it. I almost cried. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized something. I had never heard anyone else out there. There were no other campers. No one at all. What I had experienced out there, I still don't know. But I do know one thing. I won't be going back to those woods. Not ever again. Something out there knew I was there, and whatever it was, I don't ever want to find out. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the sense of something lurking in the shadows just beyond my reach. I made it home that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still following me. The fire crackled and popped in front of me, the heat from the flames cutting through the cool night air. The forest around me was thick, dense with trees whose towering trunks seemed to disappear into the black sky above. I sat on a large log, the faint smell of pine and earth lingering in the air, and I stared into the dancing flames. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, just a few days away from the city, a chance to disconnect and enjoy the quiet of nature. I had been hiking for hours earlier that day. The trail was long, winding through rugged hills and alongside a bubbling stream that cut through the forest. I'd been alone, something I preferred. There was a certain kind of peace that came with solitude. The world felt so much smaller when you were just one person in the middle of the wilderness. My tent was set up a short distance away, tucked into a small clearing, and for now I was content. The stars above shimmered through the gaps in the trees, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over me. But that calm didn't last long. As the night wore on, I began to feel something shift in the air. It wasn't something you could easily put into words, but it was there, a feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I glanced around, but all I could see were shadows and dark silhouettes of trees. The kind of shadows that seem to move with the wind but aren't really moving at all. I shook it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long day, after all, and being out here by yourself in the quiet of the forest could mess with your head. I looked back at the fire, throwing another small log onto the flames, watching the embers glow red as they burned. The firelight flickered across the leaves and rocks scattered around the campsite, creating strange, twisting shapes that didn't make any sense. But there it was again, a slight rustle in the bushes at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, eyes darting to where I thought I heard it. There was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest. The wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of leaves. I told myself it was nothing. A deer, a rabbit, the wind, whatever it was, I needed to focus on my breathing and relax. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the air felt heavier now, thicker somehow. It wasn't just the rustling in the bushes. It was the way the night seemed to press in around me. The forest had always felt peaceful before, but tonight it felt different. There was an edge to it, a sense of unease that I couldn't ignore. I grabbed my flashlight from the ground beside me and shined it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the thick underbrush and towering trunks. I let out a sigh, convincing myself it was just my imagination getting the best of me. I wasn't the type of person who got scared easily. I had hiked through some of the most remote areas before. I had camped alone in places much more isolated than this. But something about tonight felt off. The wind picked up slightly, sending a shiver down my spine. It felt colder now, though the fire should have been enough to keep the chill at bay. I stood up, stretching my stiff legs, and made my way over to my tent. I unzipped the flap, stepping inside and shaking the dirt off my boots before I sat down on my sleeping bag. I glanced over at the gear I'd laid out: my pack, a water bottle, a couple of extra layers of clothing. Everything was where I had left it, but there was something else now, something that caught my attention. A faint, distant sound, like footsteps crunching over dry leaves. I stood up quickly, feeling a rush of adrenaline. My breath caught in my throat as I peered out through the small window of my tent, looking at the shadowed area where the firelight had stopped shining. I saw nothing, no movement, but I could still hear it, faint but unmistakable, like someone or something was walking around my campsite. My first thought was to grab my knife. It was a habit, one I had learned from years of hiking in remote areas. Always be prepared. But before I could reach for it, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my pulse thudding in my ears. Every inch of my body was on high alert. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it came again. The footsteps, closer this time. I couldn't make out what it was, but there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was moving around outside my tent. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing, but it was hard. My thoughts raced as I debated my next move. I could sit here and wait, but what if whoever or whatever was out there was watching me? The feeling of being watched was growing stronger, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I grabbed my flashlight again and unzipped the tent, peering out into the darkness. The beam of light swept across the clearing, revealing nothing. But then, just on the edge of the light, I thought I saw something. A figure, barely there, just a silhouette against the trees. It was moving slowly, deliberately. I froze, my hand still on the zipper of the tent. My heart was pounding in my chest now, every muscle tensed. Was it a person? A hiker, maybe? Someone else out here for the night? But no, it was too strange, too unnatural. I couldn't explain it, but something about the way it moved didn't sit right with me. I quickly zipped the tent back up and dropped to my knees, my hands shaking as I grabbed my pack and started rummaging through it. My thoughts were a jumble, and my hands fumbled as I pulled out the flare gun I always carried with me on longer trips. It was supposed to be a safety precaution, just in case things went wrong. I wasn't sure if it was the right move, but at that moment, it was the only thing I had. I climbed out of the tent again, my eyes darting to the shadows where I had seen the figure. There was nothing there now. The rustling had stopped. The air had returned to its usual stillness. I stood there for what felt like hours, not knowing what to do. I couldn't just sit here and wait. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I made a decision then. I packed up my gear, moving as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly scanning the trees around me. I wasn't going to take any chances. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I broke camp, moving quickly and carefully. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but my instincts told me to leave. The feeling of being watched never left, even as I packed up the last of my things and began to hike away from the campsite. The trail was quiet, and the darkness around me seemed to grow even deeper as I made my way through the forest. My flashlight flickered in the growing cold, the only source of light in an otherwise pitch-black night. I didn't stop walking until I reached the trailhead. It felt like an eternity had passed, but when I finally saw the sign marking the entrance to the park, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I didn't look back. When I reached my car, I drove straight home. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something I had barely seen, barely heard, but it was there. I wasn't sure if I would ever truly understand what had happened that night, but one thing was certain. I would never go back to that spot in the woods again. It wasn't just a camping trip that went wrong. It was the sense that something out there had been watching me, and it wasn't something I could ignore. I've hiked through a lot of forests in my life, but that night will stick with me forever. And no matter how many times I tell myself it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks, I know deep down that something out there was real. It was something I couldn't explain, and sometimes that's the scariest thing of all. It was a late afternoon when I decided to pack up and head out for a camping trip by myself. I'd been feeling the weight of work and life pressing down on me, and the thought of some quiet solitude in the woods sounded like the perfect way to reset. I wasn't new to camping. I'd done it a few times before, but always with friends. This time, it was just me and the great outdoors. I drove out to a secluded national forest I had been to a few times before. It wasn't the most popular spot, but it was peaceful, which is exactly what I was looking for. The drive was long, about 2 hours from my house, but the scenery was beautiful, especially as the sun began to set. The trees were tall, casting long shadows, and the air smelled fresh and crisp, like pine and damp earth. I arrived just as it was getting dark, which was fine because I'd planned on setting up camp in the evening. I pulled up to the campsite I had in mind, one of those small, primitive sites with no electricity, no running water, just a fire pit and a clearing surrounded by dense forest. I liked it that way. I could be alone, disconnected from the world. The campsite was exactly how I remembered it, though it had been a couple of years since I last visited. The ground was slightly uneven, covered in a mix of dirt and pine needles. I unpacked my gear quickly, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a flashlight. I didn't want to waste any time. I was already starting to feel the isolation settling in, and I had to keep my mind busy. I set up the tent, making sure the stakes were firmly in the ground and the fly was securely attached. The tent wasn't big, just enough for me to sleep in, but it was comfortable. Once the camp was set up, I gathered some dry wood for the fire. I wasn't very good at starting fires, but after a couple of attempts, I finally got the flames crackling. Sitting by the fire, I watched the flames dance, the warmth spreading across my face. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife were missing. I could hear my own breathing, the occasional crackle from the fire, but not much else. That was odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just because it was getting late and the animals were winding down for the night. I ate a simple meal of canned chili, sitting on a log next to the fire. The heat from the flames felt good against the cool evening air. After eating, I lay back on the log, staring up at the stars. The sky was clear, with no light pollution from nearby towns, and I could see millions of stars twinkling above me. The night was peaceful, calm. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as the temperature began to drop. The fire was still going strong, but it didn't take away the chill that was starting to creep in. I decided it was time to call it a night. I doused the fire, making sure the embers were fully out, and climbed into my tent. Inside the tent, I zipped myself up in my sleeping bag and settled in, the air inside feeling warmer than outside. The quiet of the forest surrounded me, but I found it oddly comforting. As I lay there, the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves outside. My eyes began to close, and I could feel myself drifting off to sleep. But then, something stirred me awake. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, just a feeling, an unease in the pit of my stomach. I lay still, listening. There was a faint sound, a crackling, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was soft at first, so soft that I thought it might have been the wind. But then it grew louder, closer. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the way the sound was getting closer, more deliberate, didn't feel right. It wasn't the usual rustling of animals moving through the forest. No, this was different. It sounded like someone was walking cautiously on two legs. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I waited, my senses on high alert. The night felt even quieter now, if that was possible. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps, soft but distinct, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but I resisted. I didn't want to draw attention to myself if it was just someone passing by. But then I realized there were no other campsites nearby. I hadn't seen any other cars on the way in. I was completely alone. The footsteps circled my campsite, slow and steady. I could hear them crunching the leaves and twigs underfoot. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest now, my mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? Was it just someone lost in the woods? Or was something more sinister going on? Suddenly, the footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. I froze. I didn't dare move or make a sound. My hands were clenched tightly around the edge of my sleeping bag. I tried to control my breathing, but my heart was thumping so loudly I thought it might give me away. The forest felt suffocating in that moment, like the silence was closing in on me. I waited, holding my breath, praying for the footsteps to move on. But they didn't. They stayed right there, just outside my tent. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. And then, just as abruptly as they had started, the footsteps turned and walked away, moving off into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept my flashlight close and my ears alert, listening for any other sounds. But nothing came. The forest returned to its unnatural quiet, and the hours dragged on slowly. The night felt endless. When the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax. The sun's rays filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. The forest still felt eerie, but at least it was daylight now. I quickly packed up my gear, not wanting to spend another minute in that place. As I loaded everything into my car, I took one last look at the campsite, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it been someone, a camper or hiker, simply passing through? Or had I been alone the whole time, and it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the dark? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back there. Not for a long time, at least. Maybe some experiences are better left unexplored, better left as mysteries. I drove away from the campsite, the feeling of unease still lingering in the back of my mind. I hadn't heard any other sounds or seen anything strange after the footsteps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out there in those woods. As I drove back home, the sun fully risen and the warmth of the day beginning to fill the air, I finally felt a sense of relief. But that night, and the footsteps outside my tent, would stay with me for a long time. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't think they would understand. Some things are better kept to yourself, especially when they don't have clear answers. The woods had kept their secrets, and I was content to leave it that way. I had always been the type to enjoy the simple things in life. A weekend away from the bustle of city life, a peaceful camping trip in the woods. There was nothing better. It wasn't my first time camping. In fact, I'd been on many trips before, but this one felt different. There was a sense of unease, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was because I had decided to camp alone this time. Normally, I would go with friends, but this time I was craving solitude. I'd set out early on a Friday morning, planning to spend the entire weekend in the woods, away from everything. I drove for hours, my car rumbling along the dirt roads leading deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew thicker, the road less traveled, until I finally arrived at the campground. There were a few other campers scattered around, but for the most part, the place felt empty, just the way I liked it. I picked a spot near the edge of the woods, close enough to the water for a view, but far enough to feel secluded. Setting up camp was second nature to me. I pitched my tent, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, and the air was starting to cool. As I sat there, warming my hands by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a nagging sensation that kept me on edge. I tried to push it aside. After all, it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The forest was quiet, peaceful. The sound of the crackling fire filled the air, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind was the only other noise. I grabbed a can of beans from my pack and heated them over the fire. It was a simple meal, but it tasted good, especially after the long drive. As night fully settled in, the forest grew darker. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the trees. The stars above were bright, clearer than I'd ever seen them in the city. The quiet was almost deafening, and for a moment, I felt the isolation. It was peaceful, but also unsettling. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The woods were familiar, but in the dark, they felt foreign. The trail I walked on was faint, a mere suggestion of a path through the thick underbrush. My flashlight beam flickered in the darkness, but it wasn't enough to calm my nerves. The trees around me loomed tall, their branches swaying slightly in the wind, creating eerie shapes against the sky. I stopped for a moment, listening. Nothing. No animals, no rustling in the leaves. The air was unnervingly still. It was then that I noticed something strange. Just off the path, hidden among the trees, there was a pile of rocks. It wasn't a natural formation. It was too perfectly stacked, too deliberate. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I crouched down to get a better look, running my fingers over the rocks. They were cold, rough, and uneven, but there was something about them that felt wrong, like they didn't belong here. I stood up, looking around. The woods were silent, but there was a sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the thoughts. It was just a pile of rocks, after all. I turned to head back to camp, but something caught my eye, a movement in the distance, a figure standing between the trees, just out of the reach of my flashlight's beam. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. I squinted, trying to make out who or what it was, but the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, like it was waiting for something. My mind raced and I fought the urge to panic. Could have been another camper, but the longer I stared, the more I doubted that. The figure seemed too unnatural, too rigid. I took a step back, my instincts telling me to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness of the woods, as if it had never been there. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced around, but there was no sign of it. No rustling of leaves, no movement in the trees. I was alone. My thoughts raced as I quickly made my way back to camp. The walk felt longer this time, the darkness pressing in around me. My flashlight flickered again, casting weak light over the path. I half expected to see the figure in the shadows, but nothing was there. I arrived at camp, my nerves frayed. The fire was still burning, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I hurriedly packed up my things, not wanting to stay in the woods any longer than I had to. The rocks, the figure, it was all too strange, too unsettling. But as I packed, I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the result of too much time alone in the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my mind replaying the events over and over. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of a branch felt like it was the figure returning. My eyes never left the shadows of the trees. But by morning, I had convinced myself that it had all been a product of my own fear. I wasn't used to being alone in the woods, and my mind had likely played tricks on me. I spent the rest of the day exploring the area around my camp, trying to keep myself busy. The woods were still quiet, the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves the only sounds. I didn't see anything unusual, and slowly, I began to relax. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe there was nothing to fear. But as night fell again, the unease returned. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the natural nervousness of being alone in the woods. I built up the fire, cooked another meal, and settled in for the night. The firelight cast long shadows across the trees, and I could hear the crackling of the wood as it burned. But something was different. The stillness in the air was heavier, almost suffocating. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the sensation. I lay there for hours, tossing and turning in my sleeping bag, until I heard it. A soft rustling in the underbrush. The sound was faint, but it was enough to make my heart race. I froze, my breathing shallow. The rustling grew louder, closer. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too constant to be an animal. Then a branch snapped. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound had come from just beyond the firelight, from the dark edge of the woods. My flashlight lay on the ground beside me, but I didn't dare move to pick it up. I listened intently, straining to hear any other sounds. But there was nothing. The rustling had stopped. I sat there in the silence for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I didn't sleep a wink. By morning, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I packed up my things and decided it was time to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone in those woods. As I loaded my car and drove out of the campground, I couldn't help but glance back at the trees one last time. The woods were still calm, but something lingered in the air, something I couldn't explain. I drove away, relieved to be leaving the unsettling quiet behind. I never went back to that campground. Some places, no matter how beautiful they seem, just feel wrong. And I had learned that the hard way. I had been looking forward to that camping trip for months. Life had gotten too loud, too digital, and I needed something that would bring me back to the basics. A week in the woods, alone, with nothing but my backpack, a tent, and some food supplies sounded perfect. I had picked a spot deep in the forest, one I'd found on an old hiking forum, a place that wasn't on the main trails, barely marked, and far away from cell service or any kind of human activity. The photos someone had uploaded a few years back showed a flat clearing near a slow-moving stream, surrounded by thick pine trees and tall ferns. It looked peaceful, safe, I parked my car on a gravel turnout about 3 miles from the trailhead. From there, I hiked the rest of the way in. The pack on my back felt heavier than I remembered, but I was excited. My boots crunched over pine needles and dirt. Birds chirped somewhere high above, and the sun filtered through the canopy in soft, golden patches. It was early autumn, and the air was just starting to carry that crisp edge. Perfect weather for being out in the wild. The hike was tough in some places, especially where the trail faded into uneven terrain, and I had to rely on a combination of my compass and GPS watch to stay on track. About 4 hours in, I finally reached the clearing. Just like the photos, flat, soft ground, good tree cover, and the stream nearby trickled quietly, clean and clear. I dropped my pack and stretched out my arms, breathing deep. No cars, no people, no noise, just the forest. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the stream to use it for water, but far enough that I wouldn't be in danger if it rained heavily. After setting up camp, I gathered some dry wood and got a small fire going. I cooked a quick meal for my pack, just rice and some canned beans, and watched the flames flicker as the sun dipped lower. As night settled in, I crawled into my sleeping bag and let the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. The rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the soft babble of the stream. The first night went by without anything unusual. I woke up early with the light filtering through the tent walls, made some instant coffee, ate a protein bar, and then headed off to explore the surrounding area. I didn't go too far, just far enough to see what was around. Mostly more trees, a few clearings, and signs of old animal tracks in the mud. Felt good to be alone out there. I wasn't scared. I felt safe. That changed on the second night. Started small. While I was cooking my dinner, some dehydrated pasta, I noticed the woods felt heavier, quieter. The usual background noise of insects and birds had dropped off. I thought maybe it was just because the temperature had dipped, or maybe I was just overthinking it, but the silence was strange, too complete. I forced myself to ignore it and finished eating, then sat by the fire for a while longer before heading into my tent. I woke up in the middle of the night, not to a sound exactly, more like the absence of one. The stream, which had been a constant trickle of background noise, was silent. That was what did it. It had become part of the night's rhythm, and now it was gone. I unzipped the tent slowly and peered outside. The moon was bright enough to light up the clearing. I could see the trees, still and unmoving, the fire pit now just a ring of dark stones. Everything was motionless, dead quiet. I stepped out in my socks, not thinking straight, and walked the short distance to the stream. My breath came out in small clouds. When I reached the water's edge, I saw it wasn't dry. The water was still there, moving but barely, like something upstream had slowed it down. That didn't make sense. It wasn't cold enough to freeze. I stood there for a minute, watching, listening. Then I heard it. Something moving, far off, but getting closer. Slow footsteps, heavy, not in a hurry, just steady. I turned and went back to my tent, trying not to make noise. My heart was thudding now, and I didn't know why. Could have been an animal, could have been nothing. But I zipped myself back in, grabbed the knife I always kept next to me, and just lay there, staring at the tent wall. The footsteps didn't come any closer. They just stopped, somewhere out in the trees. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to sunlight. Everything looked normal again. The birds were back. The stream was bubbling like usual. I told myself I had dreamed it. Maybe I was just jumpy being alone for too long. I kept busy that day, gathering more firewood, double-checking my trail back to the car, and even carving a few notches into the trees to mark my way. I didn't want to get lost if something weird happened again. That night, I made a bigger fire and sat up longer, trying to stay alert. I even moved a few small sticks and pine cones around the edge of the clearing, little traps, sort of. If anything walked through them, I'd hear it. I was exhausted but kept myself awake until almost 1 a.m. before finally crawling into the tent. I woke up again. This time, the air inside the tent felt wrong. Warmer, almost damp. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Then I heard the crunch of pine needles, closer than last time. Just outside. I didn't move. The sound was soft but deliberate. Someone or something was walking slowly around my tent. I stayed perfectly still, holding the knife tight. I could hear my own heartbeat. Whatever it was didn't try to open the tent. It just circled once, then again. Then it stopped. The silence dragged on. I wanted to peek out, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the flap. Eventually, I heard it move away, back toward the trees. Again, I must have fallen asleep after that, though I don't remember doing it. I was just suddenly waking up again to daylight. When I got out, I looked around the clearing. The traps I had set were disturbed. Not all of them, just a few. Enough to know I hadn't imagined it. There were footprints, too. Not boot prints. Barefoot. Human. But not fresh. Whoever it was had walked around during the night, and the dew had softened the edges by morning. They looked old. Dirty. Like they'd been walking barefoot in the woods for days. That was the moment I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly. Didn't even cook breakfast. I just shoved everything into my pack, doused the fire with stream water, and started back toward the trailhead. I didn't run, but I walked fast, kept checking behind me every few minutes. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. And maybe I was. Twice I thought I heard twigs snapping behind me, but I never saw anyone. The forest felt different now. Not peaceful, not quiet, just tense. When I reached the car, I tossed my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. The gravel road felt like the longest drive of my life. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was back in town, parked at a gas station, and surrounded by people. Back home, I spent the next few days trying to make sense of it. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't even check the trail forums again. I couldn't explain it. No ghosts, no monsters, just someone out there. Someone living in the woods, maybe. Someone who had been watching me since I arrived. I still go camping sometimes, but not alone. Never that deep. And I always choose places with other people nearby, with cell service, with actual trails and rangers and maps. That trip changed how I think about being out there. It's not just nature you need to worry about. It's what else might be hiding in it. Watching, waiting, doing nothing until the night gets quiet enough that even a slow footstep feels like thunder. I don't usually go camping alone. It's not that I'm scared of the woods or anything, but I like having someone around. Someone to help pitch the tent, someone to sit with by the fire, someone to share the silence when it gets too quiet. But this time was different. Life had been a bit much lately. Work was burning me out. City noise was constantly in my head, and my phone never stopped buzzing. I needed a break, and I figured a solo camping trip deep in the mountains would be the perfect escape. No distractions, no people, just me and nature. I picked a spot in a remote part of the national forest about 4 hours drive from my place. It wasn't one of those official campgrounds with marked trails and fire pits. I wanted something far out, something quiet and untouched. I did some research online, found a few old forums where hikers had talked about a hidden clearing near a lake, barely accessible unless you hiked in at least an hour off the nearest forest road. It sounded perfect. I packed everything I'd need for 3 nights: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, water filter, food, knife, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, a map, compass, and even a satellite phone just in case. I left my car parked at the end of a rough dirt road, locked it, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and started hiking. The trail wasn't easy. It had clearly not been used in a long time. I had to push through thick branches and climb over fallen trees. It was quiet, too quiet at times. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle from a squirrel or something small darting through the underbrush. After a little more than an hour, I reached the clearing. It was just as the forums described. A flat grassy patch surrounded by thick pine trees with a narrow view of a small lake on the other side. The water was calm and glassy, reflecting the sky like a mirror. There was no one around, no sign of humans, no fire rings, no trash, just untouched wilderness. I set up my tent near the tree line, giving myself some shelter from the wind. I boiled some water with my stove and made dehydrated pasta. After eating, I sat by the lake and watched the sky darken. The stars came out bright and clear, and the moon cast a silver sheen over the trees. I felt calm. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. That first night, I slept well. I woke up once around 3 a.m. to pee and noticed how absolutely silent the forest was. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead silent. No rustling, no owls, no insects. Just the sound of my own breath and the crunch of my feet on pine needles. It was eerie, but I didn't think much of it. Forests can get like that sometimes, especially this deep in. The next morning, I had oatmeal and coffee, filtered some water from the lake, and explored the area. I didn't go too far, just followed the lake's edge and tried to get a feel for the land. It was all wild, no trails, just game paths here and there. I found some deer tracks, a pile of old droppings, and what looked like the remains of a small animal. Maybe a rabbit or squirrel, mostly just bones and fur. I sat by the lake that afternoon, writing in my notebook, just reflecting. I wasn't expecting to feel uneasy, but something was gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't like I saw anyone or anything. I didn't, but the feeling was strong enough that I kept glancing over my shoulder. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I mean, being alone out here can mess with your head. Still, I couldn't relax the way I wanted to. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up. Around midnight, I heard something outside the tent. At first, I thought it was wind or a raccoon, but then I realized it was steady. It sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps, crunch, pause, crunch. I sat up and held my breath. The footsteps circled halfway around the tent and then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I waited for what felt like forever, clutching my knife in the dark, straining to hear anything else. But there was nothing. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion, but it wasn't restful. The next morning, I got up and looked around. There were no prints. The ground was hard-packed and covered in pine needles, so it would have been hard to leave any anyway. But everything else was untouched. My gear was fine, food wasn't disturbed. Still, that feeling of being watched came back even stronger. I told myself I was just letting the isolation get to me, that I needed to push through it. I wasn't ready to leave yet. I spent most of the day trying to distract myself. I hiked further along the lake and found a small waterfall feeding into it. I followed a creek for a while, took some pictures, and tried to just enjoy the day. But every so often, I would stop and listen. I kept hearing faint snapping branches, like someone walking just far enough away that I couldn't see them. I would call out, not with words, just loud claps or coughs, to let anything or anyone know I was there. Nothing ever answered. Nothing ever came close. That evening, I was cooking some rice and beans when I saw something across the lake. It was quick, like a shape, a shadow just behind the trees on the opposite bank. I froze and stared for minutes, waiting for it to move again. But nothing happened. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe it wasn't. I didn't know anymore. I was starting to question myself, and that scared me more than anything else. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in my sleeping bag, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard those footsteps again. This time, they were slower, closer. They came right up to the tent. I could hear breathing. Not loud, not raspy, just soft and steady. I didn't dare move. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. Then, whatever it was walked away, not quickly, just slowly fading into the trees. I waited until dawn. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up. I didn't eat. I didn't filter water. I just tore down camp, threw everything in my pack, and left. I didn't follow the same way back. I didn't want to go near the lake again. I cut through the forest, using my compass to aim for the road. I knew it was risky. Getting lost was a real possibility, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. About halfway through, I noticed something strange. There were faint signs of an old trail. Bent grass, snapped branches. But it wasn't the one I came in on. I followed it anyway, hoping it would lead me somewhere. Then I found it. An old, rusted hunting blind up in a tree, the kind with a small ladder nailed into the trunk. It didn't look like it had been used in years. I climbed up to look around, thinking maybe I could get a better view, maybe see the road. But what I found chilled me. There were empty food wrappers up there, modern ones, a crushed water bottle, a stained blanket stuffed into the corner, and in the far end, a pile of cigarette butts. Someone had been here recently. I scanned the forest below, but I didn't see anyone. Still, I got out of there fast. I didn't care where the trail led anymore. I just kept moving. Eventually, I stumbled out onto the road, about half a mile from where I had parked. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. Everything was still there, untouched. I threw my gear in the back and drove until I reached cell service, then pulled over and just sat in silence. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I was sure now that I wasn't alone in those woods. Later, I reported what I'd seen to the local ranger station. They took my statement but didn't seem too alarmed. Said it was probably an illegal hunter or someone squatting out there. They said it happens more than people realize. That didn't make me feel any better. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I haven't been camping since. I still love nature, still go hiking, but I stick to populated trails now. Ones where I can see other people and where help isn't too far away. That trip changed something in me. It wasn't about fear, not exactly. It was about realizing how easily someone could be out there, hiding, watching, doing whatever they want, and no one would know. No phone service, no one to hear you scream, no one even knowing where to look if you went missing. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also big, and it doesn't care if you vanish. I went out there looking for peace. What I found instead was a reminder of how small I really am, and how close danger can be, even when you can't see it. It started off like any other solo camping trip I'd taken over the last couple of years. I've always enjoyed being alone in the woods, away from the noise of everything. No phone, no cars, no people. Just me, a tent, and nature. This time, I picked a spot deep in a national forest I'd never explored before. It wasn't one of the major tourist areas, which was exactly why I chose it. I didn't want marked trails or other hikers around. I wanted quiet. I parked my car at the edge of the forest where a small dirt road ended. There wasn't a single other vehicle around. The air was still, and the trees were tall, thick, and silent. I grabbed my backpack, which held everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a water filter, a camp stove, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a hunting knife I always carried just in case. I double-checked everything before locking the car and starting my hike in. The first few hours of the hike were peaceful. The trail wasn't official, but I had found an old logging path on a satellite map that seemed like it led deep enough into the forest. I followed it, marking a few trees with bright tape every now and then so I could find my way back. The forest grew denser the further I went. The light filtered through the canopy in patches. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't the only one moving around. After about 4 hours, I found a small clearing that looked perfect. The trees opened just enough to let in some light. There was a soft patch of ground with no rocks or roots, ideal for a tent. A small stream ran about 100 yards away, and I could hear it clearly. I set up camp quickly, drove the stakes into the ground, laid out my sleeping bag, and set my small gear bag inside the tent. I boiled water and made instant noodles while watching the sunlight fade between the trees. That first night, I slept well. It was cold, but I was used to that. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and lay still, listening to the sounds of the forest. An owl in the distance, a few twigs snapping now and then. Nothing unusual, just nature doing what it does. I woke up around 6 a.m. to the soft light of dawn. The forest was quiet, a little mist curling low across the ground. I made coffee on the camp stove and walked down to the stream to refill my water bottle and wash my face. It was on the second day that things started to feel different. I spent the morning hiking around, just getting a feel for the area. I didn't see any signs of people, no footprints, no wrappers, nothing. I climbed a ridge nearby that gave a good view of the surrounding forest. Trees as far as I could see. It made me feel small, but in a good way. I came back to camp around noon, made lunch, and sat in my camp chair reading a paperback I'd brought. Around mid-afternoon, I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was close. A branch snapped, not like a twig breaking under a squirrel, but something heavier. I froze and listened. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no animals running off. Just quiet. I tried to shake it off, probably a deer. But something about the way the sound came and then nothing followed felt off. I stood up, looked around the edge of the clearing, and didn't see anything. Still, I picked up my knife and slipped it into my pocket, just in case. The rest of the day passed quietly, but I was more alert. Every sound made me look up. Every gust of wind rustling the leaves made me tense. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up, listening, trying to hear through the layers of silence. At one point, deep into the night, I thought I heard footsteps. Slow, steady, and heavy. They didn't come close, just far enough that I couldn't be sure if I was imagining them or not. I held my breath in the sleeping bag, my heart pounding. Then silence again. I didn't move until the sky started to lighten. On the third day, I knew I had to shake off the nerves. I chalked it up to overthinking and not being used to complete isolation. I made a plan to do a longer hike that day, circle around a few ridges, and be back before dark. I packed a small bag with some snacks, water, a compass, and a flashlight just in case. I left a marker near the tent so I could find my way back easily. The hike was good for a few hours. I found some game trails, saw a few deer in the distance, and spotted bear tracks near a muddy patch. Nothing fresh, but I noted it mentally. Around 3 p.m., as I turned to head back, I noticed something strange near one of my trail markers. The tape was missing. I had tied a piece of bright orange tape to a branch, but it was gone. Not fallen, gone. Like someone had untied it and taken it. I checked the ground around it. No tracks, no drag marks, nothing that looked like an animal had messed with it. That uneasy feeling returned. I kept going, now double-checking my path. I made it back to camp as the sun started to dip low. I could see my tent in the clearing just ahead, and then I stopped. There was something off. Took me a second to figure it out. The tent was still there, but the flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it shut that morning. I always do. I ran the last few steps to the tent, knife in hand, heart pounding. Inside, nothing looked stolen, but everything had been moved. My sleeping bag was unrolled, the gear bag was unzipped, and my flashlight was lying outside the tent. Whoever had come didn't take anything, they just looked through it. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Why not steal something? Why just mess with my stuff? I packed everything up as fast as I could. It was almost dark, but I didn't want to sleep there again. I knew hiking out in the dark wasn't a good idea, but staying felt worse. I kept my knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other and started down the trail. The forest at night is a different place. The sounds are sharper, the dark is heavier. I moved quickly but carefully, sticking close to the tape markers I had left, at least the ones still there. A few hours into the hike, my flashlight flickered. I smacked it gently, and it came back, but I knew the batteries were wearing out. I slowed down, trying to conserve power. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were behind me, not right behind, but close enough. I turned and flashed the light back down the trail. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But when I turned to keep going, I saw something that made me freeze. One of my tape markers was tied differently. Not in the quick knot I use, but looped into a more complex knot, almost decorative. That wasn't mine. Someone had been ahead of me. Someone had time to change it. I stood there, not knowing what to do. Then I made a decision. I stepped off the trail. I turned my flashlight off and stood behind a tree, crouched low. I waited. Minutes passed. Then I saw movement. A figure walked slowly up the trail. No flashlight, no sound, just a steady movement. They stopped near the knot, turned, and looked around. I stayed completely still. They stood there for maybe 30 seconds, then kept walking, right past the tree I was hiding behind. I didn't recognize them. They wore a dark jacket and a hat pulled low. I waited until they were well out of sight before I moved again. I didn't go back on the trail. I made my own way through the woods, using the stars and my compass to guide me. It was harder and slower, but I didn't care. I moved all night, barely stopping, my body aching and my feet sore. Around dawn, I finally saw the dirt road through the trees. My car was still there. I ran the last 100 yards, unlocked it with shaking hands, and got inside. I didn't wait. I drove straight out of the forest, not stopping until I hit a gas station 2 towns away. I sat there in the parking lot for almost an hour, just breathing, hands still gripping the steering wheel like I was afraid someone would follow me. I never figured out who that person was or what they wanted. I told myself it could have been a hunter or some backwoods survivalist or maybe just a really weird camper. But something in my gut told me it wasn't random. They'd been following me, watching, maybe from the first night, maybe even before that. I haven't gone camping alone since then. I still love the forest and I still go on day hikes sometimes, but I always stick to the trails now. Always where there are other people around. That trip changed the way I see the woods. It reminded me that out there, it's not just animals you have to worry about. Sometimes the real danger is other people. People who know the land better than you do, who move without a sound, and who never need to say a word to make their presence known. And when they decide to come close, it's already too late to pretend you're alone. It was the first week of October, and the air had that dry, earthy smell of falling leaves and distant campfires. I'd been planning a solo camping trip for a while now. Just me, my gear, and the forest. No people, no noise, no responsibilities. I found a remote spot deep in the forest preserve, far from the main trails, where there was a clearing beside a small, still lake. It looked perfect on the map. No marked campsites, no foot traffic. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive to the forest took a little over 4 hours. I had my tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, food, a large water bladder, and everything else I could think of. I packed extra batteries, a power bank, a multi-tool, and a map, even though my GPS was working fine. I checked the weather too. It was supposed to be cold but dry. Perfect camping weather. When I reached the edge of the forest where I had to park my car, I loaded everything into my pack, slung it on my back, and locked the car. Then I started hiking. The first hour of the hike was along a rough but still somewhat visible trail. After that, I was bushwhacking through thicker woods, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. The trees were mostly pine and birch, the ground soft and damp with years of fallen needles and rotting leaves. It was quiet in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. No hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional creak of trees, the snap of twigs under my boots, and the far-off call of a bird. I kept checking my GPS every 15 minutes, making sure I stayed on course. It took me nearly 3 hours to reach the clearing by the lake. It was more beautiful than I'd hoped. The water was still, surrounded by thick trees on 3 sides, and the clearing opened up just enough to let the sunlight hit the grass. I set my pack down, stretched my shoulders, and walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking for flat ground and any signs of wildlife. I didn't see any footprints or animal tracks. It felt untouched. I set up my tent near the treeline with the opening facing the lake. I staked it down properly and laid out my sleeping bag and pad inside. I boiled water for a dehydrated meal and sat on a flat rock, watching the sun go down behind the trees. The sky turned orange and pink, and the lake reflected it perfectly. That night, the stars were so clear it felt like I could see everyone. I sat out by the water until it got too cold and then crawled into my sleeping bag. I woke up once during the night to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a light rustling, like something moving through the brush. I stayed still, listening. After a minute, it stopped. I told myself it was a rabbit or a raccoon and went back to sleep. The next morning, I made coffee and ate a protein bar, then decided to hike a bit around the lake. I marked my campsite on the GPS and took a small day pack with water, a knife, and some snacks. I followed the edge of the lake for maybe an hour before turning into the trees, wanting to see if there was anything interesting deeper in. I noticed some deer tracks and followed them for a while, snapping a few photos of the trees and mushrooms I found growing on old logs. It was around midday when I found something strange. I was walking along a ridge when I saw what looked like a collapsed structure below. It was maybe 50 feet down the slope, half hidden by trees and overgrowth. I carefully made my way down to it. It was an old wooden cabin, not the kind built for vacation. This one looked ancient. Weathered gray logs, a rusted tin roof, and no windows. The door was off its hinges, leaning against the frame. I walked around it slowly, peering in through the gaps in the wall. It was empty inside, just dirt floor, a broken chair, and a pile of old, rotting clothes in one corner. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years. There were scratch marks on one of the door frames, deep ones like from an animal. But the weirdest thing was a chain bolted to the inside wall. It was thick, like the kind you'd use to hold a large dog or livestock, and it ended in a broken metal ring. I felt a tightness in my chest. I didn't know why, but the place made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. I backed out of the structure slowly and climbed back up the ridge. I didn't take any pictures of it. I just wanted to get back to camp. When I got back, everything looked the same. My tent was fine. Nothing had been disturbed. I tried to shake off the feeling and made lunch. But the whole afternoon, I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for sounds I wasn't even sure I'd heard. I went to bed early that night. I zipped the tent up tight, double-checked that I'd packed all my food in the bear canister, and tried to tell myself that it was just a weird old shack, nothing more. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up again. This time it was footsteps, slow, heavy ones. Not a deer, not a raccoon. I froze in my bag, holding my breath. The steps came closer, crunching on the leaves just outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and shined it toward the sound. Nothing. Then I heard a sniffing sound, like something breathing heavily through its nose. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Whatever it was, it circled the tent slowly. Once, then again, then silence. I waited, heart pounding, until the sun started to rise. When I finally crawled out, I saw the footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet. No shoes. They circled my tent twice, then disappeared into the woods. I packed everything in record time. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't sit down. I shoved everything into my pack, broke camp, and started hiking back toward the car. I didn't care how far it was. I just wanted to get out. But the forest didn't look the same on the way back. I followed my GPS, but the trail seemed unfamiliar. Trees looked different. I didn't recognize landmarks I'd passed on the way in. I thought maybe I was just rattled. I tried to stay calm and focused on the direction. 2 hours in, I realized I was going in circles. My GPS still worked, but I was passing the same fallen tree I'd seen 30 minutes earlier. I knew it was the same one because of the axe marks on the bark. I hadn't made any turns, but somehow I was looping. I stopped, took a breath, and forced myself to eat something. I drank water and studied the map. I marked my current location and decided to head west, straight west, until I hit the old trail I'd used on the way in. I walked for another hour, watching the sun, checking the compass. Then I found the cabin again. I hadn't gone west, or maybe I had, but the forest had other ideas. The cabin looked worse in daylight. I didn't go near it this time. I turned around and walked in the exact opposite direction. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I just laid my sleeping bag against a tree and kept my boots on. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shack, that chain, those footprints. In the early morning, I heard movement again. Not footsteps this time, but something crashing through the underbrush. I climbed a nearby tree, as high as I could safely go, and waited. After a while, I saw something move between the trees. A man, naked, covered in dirt, hunched forward like he was part animal. He didn't look up. He sniffed the ground, paused where I'd slept, then moved on. I stayed in that tree for hours. When I finally climbed down, I ran. I didn't care if I was off course. I just ran. At some point, I found the edge of a dry creek bed. I followed it for what felt like miles. Eventually, it crossed a game trail. I saw a fresh boot print in the mud and nearly cried. I followed it until I hit the old road I'd driven in on. When I got to my car, it was untouched. I threw my pack in the back and got in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. I drove without stopping until I reached a gas station an hour away. I stayed there for a long time, just sitting in the car, staring at the steering wheel. I never went back to that forest. I still go camping sometimes, but only in campgrounds with people around. I never go off-trail anymore. I never trust old maps. And if I see something strange in the woods, I leave it alone. I don't know what that man was or what that cabin was for. I don't want to know. All I know is something was out there, something human but not right, and I came way too close to it. That trip changed how I see the woods. They're still beautiful, still peaceful, but they're not empty. And some places are better left alone. I remember the day I decided to go camping, one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions. It wasn't anything planned, and I didn't have a group with me. Just me, my gear, and a craving for the solitude of the woods. I've been camping before, so I wasn't a complete rookie. The quiet, the fresh air, and the feeling of being far away from the rush of everyday life had always been something I cherished. The day started off clear, and I packed my tent, sleeping bag, a small portable stove, and enough food to last for a couple of days. It wasn't anything fancy, just enough to get by. The sun was still high when I got into my car and started driving. I didn't want to be in a crowded campsite, so I chose a more secluded area that wasn't too far away. The kind of place you'd have to drive a bit off the beaten path to find, but it wasn't too much of a hassle. The road to the site wasn't well maintained. The gravel crunched under the tires, and I had to maneuver around large rocks and uneven patches. I didn't mind though, it was part of the adventure. After about an hour of driving, I reached the area. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, remote, and beautiful. The trees surrounded the campsite like a natural barrier, and the sound of a nearby creek added a peaceful ambience to the surroundings. Setting up my tent was easy enough. The ground was soft but firm, perfect for sleeping. I didn't take long to get everything arranged. I lit a small fire, just enough to keep me warm, and cook some dinner. As I sat by the fire, I felt that familiar peace of being away from everything. No deadlines, no distractions, just the crackling of the fire and the chirping of crickets. That evening, as the sun set and the woods darkened, a chill slowly crept in. I threw on my jacket and stared into the flames. It wasn't until later, as the fire began to burn low, that I noticed how eerily quiet it had gotten. The usual sounds of wildlife had stopped. There wasn't even the occasional rustle of leaves. The wind had died down, and the air felt thick. It wasn't exactly unsettling, but there was something in the stillness that felt off. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I was about to head to bed when I heard something in the distance. A soft sound at first, just the faintest crack of a twig snapping, like someone stepping in the woods. I froze, straining my ears to listen, but the sound didn't repeat. The forest around me was silent again, almost too silent. I was sure I was just being paranoid, and I figured it was probably just an animal moving through the underbrush. Still, my eyes darted to the dark edges of the camp, searching for anything unusual, but there was nothing. The trees were still, and the shadows were deep. I decided to go to sleep anyway. I rolled into my sleeping bag, zipped up my tent, and turned off the flashlight. But sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept drifting back to that moment, to the sound I heard. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the wilderness. But in the stillness, every little noise seemed amplified. The wind rustled the trees above, and I could hear the occasional drop of water from the creek. The distant howl of a coyote echoed through the trees. But there was no more twigs snapping, no footsteps. I eventually drifted off, but it didn't last long. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something heavy moving through the woods. My heart rate spiked as I listened, trying to place the noise. It was too far away to be close to my tent, but it wasn't like any animal I'd heard before. It was almost like something large was moving through the trees deliberately, slowly. My first thought was bear, but it didn't quite sound like one. The noise stopped, and the silence returned. I held my breath, waiting. I told myself it was probably nothing, but then I heard it again. A deep, muffled rustling, as if something was pushing through thick bushes. My anxiety began to rise. I tried to convince myself that it was an animal, maybe a deer or some other large creature. But as the minutes stretched on and the sounds continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I slowly reached for my flashlight, but I hesitated before turning it on. What if it was something else? I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. I stayed perfectly still, waiting. Every small movement in the woods felt magnified. The shadows of the trees outside my tent swayed in the night breeze, casting long, eerie shapes across the fabric. Then I heard something new, closer this time, the unmistakable crunch of dirt and leaves. It was right outside my tent. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My mind raced with thoughts, none of them good. Maybe it was a person, maybe someone who had wandered into the woods and gotten lost. But that didn't explain the sound of whatever it was moving like it had a purpose, moving in a pattern, slow and deliberate. I felt paralyzed, unsure whether to stay silent or make a move. For what felt like an eternity, the noise outside my tent didn't stop. I kept holding my breath, hoping whatever it was would just go away. But then it stopped completely. The woods fell silent again. My pulse raced as I listened for anything at all to indicate that it was safe. But there was nothing, just silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the stillness of the night. My heart thudded in my chest as I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. I stepped outside, my flashlight scanning the area. My breath came in shallow gasps as I checked the trees, the brush, the clearing. There was nothing, no footprints, no signs of movement, just the cold, empty forest. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but none of them made sense. The sounds I heard had come from right here. There was no way I imagined it. I was about to head back into the tent when I heard it again. A low, distant growl. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a human. It was something else. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I stood frozen in place. The sound came again, louder this time. It seemed to echo from deep in the woods, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I quickly zipped my tent back up, my mind racing. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the thought of driving through those roads in the middle of the night scared me more than anything. I decided to wait until morning. I stayed in my tent, flashlight on, listening intently, but there was no more noise. The growl stopped. The forest was still again. My mind wouldn't let go of the feeling that something wasn't right. I had never been so uneasy in the woods before. As dawn broke, I packed up quickly. I didn't feel like sticking around. Whatever had happened the night before, it didn't feel right. I didn't even want to think about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The drive back was uneventful, but I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. I couldn't explain the sounds I heard, but the thought of them stuck with me long after I left the woods. Even now, whenever I go camping, I can't help but wonder if there was something out there that night, something I'll never fully understand. I had been wanting to take a break from everything for a while. Work had been eating up my energy, and the constant noise of the city felt like it was drilling holes into my head. I needed quiet, something real, something far from screens and traffic and people talking all the time. So I packed up my gear, filled the tank of my car, and drove out to the forest a few hours outside the city. It was a national park, not very well known, and I liked that. I wanted solitude more than anything else. The place I chose was about a mile hike from the nearest road. The trail wasn't marked, but I had researched the area and found that there was a clearing near a small stream. I figured it would be perfect. I carried everything in one big pack. My tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a compact gas stove, some tools, first aid, flashlight, and an extra battery pack for emergencies. I also had a knife clipped to my belt and a can of pepper spray just in case I ran into a wild animal. I parked my car off the gravel road, locked it, and started the hike. The air was cool and fresh. It was late October, and the leaves were starting to turn. Reds, oranges, and yellows covered the trees like a painting. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of something small in the bushes. It was peaceful, just like I wanted. The hike took about 40 minutes. I had to go slow because the terrain wasn't smooth. A lot of loose rocks and tree roots could easily trip someone not paying attention. When I reached the clearing, I was tired but satisfied. It was perfect. The stream ran along the edge of the clearing, and tall pines circled the area. There was a soft bed of moss and fallen leaves, which made it easier to pitch my tent. I set everything up carefully. Tent first, then the sleeping bag inside. I gathered some dry wood for a small fire later and stacked it safely away from the tent. By the time the sun started going down, I had a small fire going. I sat next to it, eating a simple meal of heated canned beans and bread. It wasn't gourmet, but it felt good eating it out in the open, surrounded by nothing but nature. I watched the flames dance, listening to the water flowing gently nearby. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. That night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're completely disconnected. No phones ringing, no car horns, no glowing lights from buildings. Just the dark, the cool air, and the sound of nature. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds. The sun had just started to rise, and the inside of my tent was glowing with soft light. I stretched, got out of my sleeping bag, and stepped outside. The fire was out, as I had smothered it before bed. Everything looked untouched. I boiled some water on the small gas stove and made coffee. Just black, nothing fancy. Tasted better than any coffee I'd had in the city. I spent the morning exploring a little around the area. I didn't want to wander too far, just in case I lost my bearings. I followed the stream upstream for about half an hour, then circled back. I saw some deer tracks, and once I caught sight of one in the distance. It noticed me, froze, and then darted away into the trees. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I collected more wood, reinforced my tent stakes, and took my time cooking a better meal, some rice with dried vegetables. I read a bit from a paperback I'd brought. When the sun started dipping, I started the fire again. This time, it didn't feel as peaceful. Maybe it was just me overthinking, but the forest didn't sound the same. The birds seemed quieter, and the wind had picked up. There was a weird tension in the air, like the trees were holding their breath. I told myself it was nothing. I had read that wind can change animal behavior, and maybe it was just that. Still, I kept my knife a little closer that night. I made sure the fire was fully out again before I climbed into my tent and zipped it shut. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was pitch dark. No moon, no stars, no sound. My eyes opened suddenly like something had jolted me awake. I lay there listening. Nothing, but something didn't feel right. My skin was cold, and not just because of the night air. It was like my body was reacting to something my brain hadn't caught up to yet. Then I heard it, a single faint crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. Very slow, then another, and another. It was outside my tent, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for the knife. I just listened. More steps, slowly circling. Not fast, not loud, just steady. It didn't sound like an animal. I've heard deer and raccoons before. They move faster, lighter. This sounded deliberate, like someone trying not to make too much noise, but not hiding either. I lay there for what felt like hours. Eventually, the steps stopped. I waited longer. I don't know how long. Maybe half an hour. Maybe more. I couldn't hear anything else. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent just a little. Nothing. Just darkness and the trees. I didn't see anything or anyone, but I didn't sleep after that. I just stayed awake, knife in hand, waiting for morning. When the sun came up, I stepped out cautiously. Everything looked the same, but I noticed something about 20 feet from my tent. The moss and leaves were disturbed in a way that wasn't natural. A narrow path like someone had been walking in circles. No clear footprints, just the evidence of movement. That scared me more than anything else, because it meant I hadn't imagined it. I told myself again that maybe it had been an animal, but that part of my brain that keeps track of danger, the one that doesn't care about logic or reason, wasn't convinced. I spent the morning deciding whether to pack up and leave or stick to my plan. I had food for one more night. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was, but I didn't explore that day. I stayed near the tent, sharpening sticks and making sure I knew exactly where my gear was. The day went by slowly. I barely ate. I just sat and listened, waiting for the sun to go down. When it finally did, I didn't start a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I stayed inside the tent, holding the knife again. Then, just like the night before, I heard it again. Crunch. Slow steps. Circling. Closer this time. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I thought about jumping out and yelling, but if it was someone dangerous, that might make it worse. I waited. The steps stopped again, but I knew they hadn't gone. They were just standing there. Then I heard something that made my blood turn cold. A zipper. Very gently, the zipper of my tent moved a few inches. Not all the way, just enough to show someone was right there, touching it. I didn't think. I slashed out with the knife through the fabric. I heard a grunt and fast movement through the leaves. I burst out of the tent, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods. I saw a shape moving fast between the trees. I didn't chase it. I didn't care who or what it was. I packed everything in a panic. Threw my sleeping bag into the pack, barely rolled the tent, just jammed it in. I didn't care about neatness. I just wanted to be gone. I hiked back in the dark. I slipped a few times, scraped my hand on a rock, but I didn't stop. I made it to the car just as the sky started turning gray. I threw my pack in, locked the doors, and drove off without looking back. I didn't tell anyone when I got back. Not at first. What would I say? That I think someone followed me into the woods and watched me at night? That they opened my tent while I was inside? I didn't even know who it was or what they wanted. But I know I wasn't imagining it. That torn part of the tent, the disturbed moss, the shape running into the trees, they were all real. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Since then, I haven't been camping alone. I still love nature, still go hiking, but I don't sleep out in the wild anymore. Not by myself, because out there, in the dark, without walls or locks or lights, you're just a small, soft thing in the middle of a big, quiet place. And sometimes someone else is out there too, watching, and that's enough to change everything. I had been planning a solo camping trip for a long time. After months of working behind a screen, I felt like I needed to get out and reset. I chose a place that wasn't too far from where I lived, but far enough to feel cut off from everything. Around a 5-hour drive deep into a national forest I hadn't explored before. It wasn't a designated campsite. I had done that kind of camping before, but this time I wanted something more remote, more quiet. No other people, no cell service, no marked trails. Just me, my gear, and the woods. The place I picked was in a patch of forest that had no road access. I parked my car near a dirt path that led off the last bit of gravel road and hiked in about 4 miles with my pack before I found a flat area near a small creek. The trees were thick but not too dense, and there was plenty of dry wood around. I set up camp in a little clearing surrounded on all sides by tall pines, with a view of the creek just 20 feet away. By the time I set up my tent and got everything in order, the sun was already low. I gathered firewood and cooked some food over the flames. It was peaceful, quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The air was fresh. I could hear the soft running of the creek and the occasional rustle in the trees from squirrels or birds. No cars, no voices, just nature and the fading light. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the slow creaking of trees swaying in the breeze. The first full day went by smoothly. I hiked around the area, did some exploring, and even found signs of old logging activity. Broken stumps and what looked like rusted equipment half buried in dirt and leaves. I took mental notes of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost and always kept my compass with me. I was cautious, but I also felt confident. I'd camped alone before, I had enough food, water filters, and gear to stay out there for at least 5 days. It was on the second night that things started to feel a little off. I had just finished eating and was sitting by the fire, watching the flames twist and crackle, when I heard a sound that didn't fit with the rest of the forest noise. It was faint, but definitely there. Something like a soft thud, followed by a dragging noise. It came from the direction of the creek. I paused and listened carefully. For a while, I didn't hear anything else, and I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer walking through the brush, or a raccoon flipping over rocks. Still, I stood up and walked to the edge of my camp, peering into the trees. I couldn't see anything unusual. The fire cast long shadows, and my headlamp didn't reach far into the dark. I decided not to dwell on it. I went back to my fire, added a few more logs, and sat down again. The noise didn't return, and eventually I went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I lay still in my sleeping bag, eyes open in the pitch darkness of the tent. Then I heard it again. A very slow, dragging noise, maybe 15 to 20 feet from where I lay. It wasn't constant. It would start, then stop, then start again. My heart started to race. I held my breath, trying to hear more clearly. I wasn't sure if it was footsteps or something else. It didn't sound like a bear or anything large crashing through the woods. It sounded human, but that didn't make sense. No one else should be out here. I reached slowly for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I waited, shining the beam toward the trees. Nothing. I got out and circled the campsite. I didn't see anything, and I didn't hear anything either. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed up for a while, sitting by the fire with my flashlight close, listening. Eventually, I went back to the tent, but I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked around the campsite again. I didn't find any footprints or signs of animals. Everything looked undisturbed. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, maybe half dreamed it while I was in that weird state between sleep and waking. I made breakfast, then went on a long hike to distract myself. I followed the creek upstream for a couple of miles and even climbed a hill that gave me a good view of the forest below. The day was clear, the air cool and crisp. It felt like the woods were trying to reassure me that everything was normal. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to catch up on sleep. I kept my knife within reach and didn't let the fire die completely before turning in. I must have dozed off because the next time I opened my eyes, the fire was out and the woods were pitch black. That's when I heard it again, slow, deliberate steps around my tent. Not heavy ones, not fast, but measured. It was like someone walking in a wide circle, just outside the ring of trees. I froze. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't even move. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I just lay there, silent, heart thumping so loud I could hear the blood in my ears. The steps stopped for a long while, then started again, this time closer. Then came the sound of something brushing against the fabric of my tent, like a hand or a stick dragging along it. I didn't move until the sun came up. When light finally crept through the trees, I unzipped the tent and jumped out, scanning everything. I saw nothing, no person, no footprints. But one thing was off. There was a small pile of stones just outside the entrance to my tent, neatly stacked. 5 flat stones, carefully placed on top of each other, that had not been there before. At that point, I decided I needed to leave. I packed up everything fast. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't even refill my water bottles. I just got my gear together, slung it over my back, and started walking the way I came. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, half expecting to see someone following me. But the woods stayed still. About 2 miles into the hike, I noticed something strange. Some of the trees I had passed before now had markings on them. Not paint, but fresh cuts in the bark. 3 vertical lines, carved clean. I hadn't seen those on the way in. I moved faster after that. The last stretch before reaching my car was the worst. The trail narrowed, and the trees pressed in closer. I kept hearing sounds behind me, twigs snapping, branches shifting, but I didn't stop. I just kept walking. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I ran the last 100 feet. As I reached it, I turned around one last time and scanned the woods. Still nothing. I unlocked the door, threw my gear into the back, and got in. I didn't even bother changing out of my hiking boots. I started the engine and got out of there as fast as I could. Back home, I spent the next few days trying to make sense of what happened. I kept checking local news to see if anyone had gone missing in that area, if there had been reports of strange people in the woods, but I found nothing. I didn't tell anyone what really happened, just said I cut my trip short because of bad weather. No one questioned it. A few weeks later, I went through my gear, reorganizing and putting things away. That's when I found something that made my stomach drop. Tucked into the outside pocket of my pack was a single flat stone, same kind as the ones stacked outside my tent. I didn't put it there. I haven't been camping alone since. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but now I stick to marked trails and established campsites. I don't wander too far off anymore. Whatever I experienced out there, it wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was something human, and that's what made it worse. There was someone in those woods, someone who had been watching me, someone who got close enough to touch my tent, leave things behind, and never be seen. I don't know what they wanted, but I know I was lucky to get out when I did. And I won't make the mistake of going that deep into the forest alone again. It was early September when I decided to take some time off and head into the mountains for a solo camping trip. I'd been working nonstop for months, stuck behind a desk, always in front of a screen, always rushing to meet deadlines. I needed space. I needed quiet. Most of all, I needed to be away from everything familiar. I packed my gear the night before, double-checked everything, filled my backpack with essentials, tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 4 days, water purifier, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and a couple of energy bars I could reach easily. I even brought a small paperback novel in case I got bored. I left home before sunrise the next day, driving for hours until I reached the trailhead of a mountain range I hadn't explored before. It was a lesser-known area, quiet and rarely crowded, and that's exactly what I wanted. I parked the car at a gravel clearing, locked it up, slung the backpack onto my shoulders, and started hiking. The trail was narrow and winding, going uphill through thick pine forests, soft with fallen needles. The sound of the city had disappeared, replaced by the occasional rustle of squirrels, the chirping of birds, and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. It was perfect. The plan was to hike 5 or 6 miles in, set up camp beside a small lake I'd seen on the map, and stay there for 3 nights. I didn't see a single person on the way in, which was surprising but not alarming. The weather was clear, not too hot, with a slight chill in the air, enough to remind me summer was ending. It took a bit longer than I expected to reach the lake. The trail wasn't well marked, and a few times I had to backtrack after realizing I'd strayed off it. I kept checking my GPS and map to make sure I was heading the right way. Eventually, after about 5 hours of steady walking, the trees opened up, and I found myself on the shore of the lake. It was beautiful, calm water, surrounded by trees with a small rocky clearing near the edge where I could set up my tent. I dropped my pack and stretched. The spot was perfect. I set up my tent with the entrance facing the lake, collected some dry wood, and boiled water to make a dehydrated meal. As the sun went down, the sky turned golden, then purple and finally dark. I sat on a rock, sipping hot tea and staring out at the water, which reflected the stars so clearly it looked like another sky. The first night was uneventful. I heard a few animals during the night, maybe raccoons or deer moving through the trees, but nothing alarming. I kept my food sealed and hung from a branch a good distance away. I slept well, better than I had in weeks. The second day was quiet too. I explored around the lake, made a small fire in the evening, cooked a simple meal, and spent most of the afternoon lying on the ground reading or just staring up through the tree canopy. I didn't see or hear any other hikers, which I thought was strange for such a scenic spot, but it didn't bother me. I'd wanted solitude, and that's what I got. It was the third day when things began to feel off. I woke up early, made coffee, and walked around the lake. On the far side, I saw something that made me stop. There were footprints, not animal prints, boot prints, clearly human. They weren't mine. They were older, slightly washed out by the weather, but recent enough to still see the tread. I hadn't seen them the day before, so either I missed them or someone had passed through after I'd walked that way. At first, I didn't think much of it. People hike here even if I hadn't seen any. But what struck me as strange was that the prints only went in one direction, toward the lake. There were no return tracks. I followed them for a bit, maybe 30 feet, and then they just stopped. They didn't turn around. They didn't fade gradually. They just ended like the person who made them vanished. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out how that made sense. Maybe the person stepped onto a rock or somewhere that didn't leave prints. I looked around, but I couldn't see where they might have gone. The ground wasn't that hard. It should have shown more signs. Eventually, I gave up and returned to my camp, but the feeling stuck with me. I kept glancing behind me on the way back, as if someone might be following. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in my tent with my eyes open, listening to every sound. I kept thinking about those footprints. Something about them didn't sit right. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It was quiet, soft, like a footstep on dry leaves. I held my breath and listened. Another soft step, then silence. I waited, heart pounding. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip the tent. I just stayed still, listening, straining to hear. Nothing. Eventually, I must have dozed off from exhaustion. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the area around the tent. No prints. No signs of anything. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was being paranoid. I tried to shake it off and went through my usual routine: breakfast, boiling water, checking my gear. But something inside me kept buzzing. A sense of unease I couldn't explain. I decided to leave a day early. It didn't feel right to stay. I packed up my tent, made sure I left no trash behind, and started heading back down the trail. I moved quickly, glancing over my shoulder more than I liked to admit. The trees seemed darker, the trail longer, every sound sharper. I didn't see anyone on the way down, just like before. I kept thinking about those footprints, about the sound I'd heard in the night. About halfway back to the trailhead, I stopped to rest and drink some water. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the edge of the trail, half hidden in a bush, was a piece of orange fabric. I stepped closer and saw it was part of a torn backpack, weathered, dirty, and partially buried under leaves. I pulled it out and turned it over. It was old, maybe a year or more, but still intact enough to recognize what it was. There was no ID, no name, but inside I found a few items: an empty water bottle, a rusted multi-tool, and a small notebook sealed in a Ziploc bag. I opened the notebook. Most of the pages were damp and unreadable, but a few near the middle were still legible. The writing was messy, hurried. The last few entries didn't make any sense. They were short, scattered lines, things like, "Something's not right," "I keep hearing it at night," and "I'm not alone." The last entry just said, "If you find this, leave. Don't wait." I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I stood there holding that notebook for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't just some lost hiker's journal. It felt like a warning. I looked around, heart thudding in my chest, and suddenly the forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt silent, too silent. I dropped the pack where I found it, closed the notebook, and stuffed it in my jacket. I didn't know what else to do. I started walking again, faster this time. Every branch crack, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept my knife in my hand. Not that I thought it would help, but it made me feel less helpless. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car still parked there, a wave of relief washed over me. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back seat, and got in. As I pulled away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. I didn't stop until I was an hour away, in a small town with a gas station. I filled up, got some coffee, and sat in the parking lot for a while. I pulled out the notebook and read through the legible pages again. They painted a picture I didn't want to believe. Someone else had camped near that lake. Someone who felt the same unease I did. Someone who vanished. I called the local ranger station once I got home and told them what I found. They took it seriously. A few days later, they contacted me again. They said they searched the area and found no signs of a body or recent activity, but they took the backpack and the notebook for their records. They thanked me for reporting it. I didn't feel like I deserved thanks. I felt lucky. Lucky that I left when I did. Lucky that I didn't ignore my instincts. I haven't gone camping alone since then. I still hike, still enjoy nature, but always with someone else now. And I never go too far off the beaten path. Because no matter how peaceful the woods might look, I learned that not everything that scares you has to be a ghost or a monster. Sometimes it's the things you can't explain, the moments that don't add up, the quiet footsteps outside your tent in the middle of the night. And those are the ones that stay with you the longest. Started out like any regular weekend plan. I'd been meaning to get away from everything for a while. Work had been stressful and I was tired of the same routine every day. A friend of mine had mentioned a remote camping spot up near an old logging road in the mountains. He said hardly anyone ever went up there anymore, and the area was peaceful, with a river running nearby and no cell service. That last part was actually what sold it for me. I wanted to disappear for a bit. I packed up my gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, some canned food, a few fresh things in a small cooler, a hand axe, extra batteries, and a bunch of other small things I always took when heading out alone. The drive took me about 4 hours from where I lived. The last part of the road was barely a road at all, just dirt and gravel with deep ruts in places. I had to drive slowly to avoid bottoming out. Trees leaned over from both sides like they were trying to cover the road back up, and I didn't see another car the entire time. Eventually, I reached the spot. It was a flat clearing surrounded by tall pines, maybe 50 yards from the river. There was a fire pit built from rocks someone had left there years ago, and not much else. I got to work setting up my tent and gathering wood. It was mid-afternoon, and the sun was starting to drop behind the hills. The place was quiet in a way that made me feel like I'd actually left everything behind. Just the wind in the trees, the occasional bird call, and the soft rush of the river. That first night went fine. I made a fire, cooked up some sausages, and sat by the flames as it got dark. The stars came out, and without any light pollution, they were bright and endless above me. I stayed up late just listening and looking around. Eventually, I turned in, crawled into my sleeping bag, and drifted off to the sounds of crickets and water. The next day, I hiked a bit upstream and found a spot where the river widened into a shallow pool. I fished for a couple of hours, caught nothing, and then came back to camp in the late afternoon. I gathered more firewood and cooked again. Everything still felt normal, calm. But that second night was when I started noticing small things. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee. I stepped out of the tent with my flashlight and walked a little ways off toward the trees. As I stood there, I heard what sounded like movement. Not animals, but something heavier. Not constant movement either. Just a single shift, like someone stepping on a dry branch and then standing still. I froze, listening. Nothing followed. No more sounds. I shined my light around the trees but didn't see anything. I waited a bit, then headed back to the tent and zipped it up behind me. I stayed awake longer than I wanted to, just listening. Eventually, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Animals make weird sounds all the time, I told myself. Maybe a deer had wandered close, but something kept bugging me. When I walked to the edge of the woods where I'd heard the sound, I noticed the dirt was disturbed. Not deep footprints, but small scuff marks like someone had turned slightly in place. The ground was dry and hard, so nothing clear had been left behind. I told myself it was probably just me the night before, but I knew it wasn't. I spent that day staying closer to camp. I kept looking over my shoulder while I gathered more wood. The woods felt too quiet. No birds that afternoon. Even the river seemed quieter. That night, I skipped the fire. I ate cold food and sat in my tent with the flap zipped shut. I kept the flashlight close. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just one noise. It was footsteps, slow and heavy, moving around the edge of my camp. I could hear them crunching on pine needles. Then they stopped, and for a long time, nothing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was lying in my sleeping bag with my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Whoever was out there, if it was a person, they weren't talking. They weren't doing anything, just standing there. I sat up slowly and reached for my axe. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't turn on the flashlight. I just waited. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard the sound again. Footsteps moving away. I listened until I couldn't hear anything. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I found something that turned the unease in my stomach into something worse. The fire pit had been disturbed, not just moved around. Someone had rearranged the stones into a small circle within the original one, like a symbol or something. I had not done that. I knew I hadn't. And then I saw that one of the sausages I'd left in the cooler, still wrapped in foil, was placed inside that circle. The cooler was otherwise untouched, nothing stolen, just that one item taken out and used like a message. I packed up most of my things right away. I didn't break camp entirely. I left the tent up, just in case. But I knew I wasn't staying another night. I took my backpack and hiked downstream to a place where I'd seen a good spot to cross the river. I thought maybe I'd make my way to the logging road from a different angle, maybe find someone, get help, or at least figure out a better exit. I was about 3 hours downstream when I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A small piece of blue plastic, just the corner of a wrapper, stuck in a bush. It was the same kind of wrapper as the energy bars I'd brought. I pulled it free, and there were muddy fingerprints on it, smudged and messy. I hadn't been down this far before. That meant someone else had come this way, someone who had my wrapper. I looked around carefully and saw more signs. Bent branches, scuffed dirt, what looked like a boot print half pressed into the soft edge of the riverbank. I turned back fast. I didn't care about getting my deposit back on the tent. I didn't care about the rest of my food or gear. I just wanted to get to my car. I pushed through the trees as fast as I could, barely stopping for anything. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone following, but I didn't. Not then. When I reached camp, I stopped cold. My tent was gone. Not collapsed, gone. No sign of it at all. The ground where it had stood was scraped clean, like someone had swept it. My fire pit had been destroyed. The rocks were scattered out into the woods. And right where the tent had been, there was a pile of twigs stacked in a neat little teepee, with a sausage laid across the top like some kind of weird offering. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted for the car, heart pounding, vision blurry. The trail felt longer than before, like it had stretched out. When I finally reached the edge of the logging road and saw my car sitting there untouched, I almost cried. I jumped in, locked the doors, and turned the engine over. It roared to life and I peeled out, tires slipping on gravel. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I drove straight through until I reached a gas station on the main highway. It was early morning by then. I sat in the lot for a long time, just breathing and trying to calm down. I didn't call the police. What would I have said? Someone messed with my camp and stole my tent? I didn't even have a name, no faces, nothing solid. Just that feeling that someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting, playing some kind of twisted game. When I finally got home, I took a long shower and dumped all my gear into a storage bin. I didn't go back to the woods after that. I canceled the trip I had planned for later that month and sold most of my camping equipment. I didn't want any of it near me anymore. Months went by. I tried to forget, but I couldn't. The sounds, the silence, that sausage left like a message. I still think about it. Whoever was out there didn't want to hurt me. Not right away. They wanted to watch. They wanted to play. That's what scared me the most. It wasn't just that I'd been followed or that someone had messed with my camp. It was how quiet they'd been, how patient. They didn't break in or take anything valuable. They left signs, rearranged things, touched the edge of my space without crossing all the way in. Like they wanted me to know I wasn't alone, but not enough to prove anything. That kind of person doesn't need a reason. They just need someone to notice. I still sleep with a light on most nights. Not because I think they followed me home, I don't. But because I know now that there are people out there who treat the woods like their own personal playground. People who wait for someone to come along who won't be missed for a few days. I got lucky. I left before they stopped playing. before they decided it was time to do more than just leave sausages in circles. I'll never camp alone again. It was early October when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the mountains. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress lately, mostly from work, and the constant noise of city life had started to wear on me. I wanted quiet. I wanted stillness. I wanted to wake up to the sound of birds and the rustling of trees instead of car horns and notifications on my phone. I looked at a map and picked a remote area of a national forest that didn't see many visitors. It was about 4 hours from where I lived and seemed isolated enough for what I was looking for. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, cooking equipment, a small axe, flashlight, extra batteries, a solar charger, knife, map, compass, first aid kit, and layered clothes for cold nights. I even packed extra water and purification tablets in case I stayed longer. I didn't tell many people where I was going, only my brother. I sent him a rough location and told him I'd check in when I got back in 3 days. The drive up was quiet. As I left the highway and got onto smaller and narrower roads, the scenery started to change. Buildings gave way to long stretches of trees. The pavement turned into gravel, then finally a dirt path. It had rained the day before, and the road was a little muddy in places, but my 4x4 handled it just fine. I finally reached a dead end near a thick patch of forest with no signs of trails or campsites nearby. That's exactly what I wanted. I parked the car and threw on my backpack. The sun was still high, so I had a few good hours of daylight to find a nice spot to set up camp. I hiked in for about an hour, taking my time, looking for somewhere flat and dry. I finally found a little clearing surrounded by trees with soft moss and dry leaves underfoot. Felt peaceful. I could barely hear anything except the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. I set up my tent and collected some firewood before it got dark. I got a small fire going, cooked a basic dinner, just some rice and canned beans, and sat there for a while just listening. No people, no planes overhead, no buzzing of electronics. Just nature, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the world's paused. That night was colder than I expected. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped up tight. I kept the fire going just a little longer before putting it out completely, not wanting to attract animals. I heard a few noises out in the forest, branches cracking, leaves rustling, but I wasn't worried. That's just normal forest sounds. I drifted off eventually. I woke up once in the middle of the night because I needed to pee. I stepped out of the tent, and the cold air hit me hard. My breath came out in clouds. Everything was dark and still. The moon was bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight. I took care of business and got back in quickly, trying not to think about how exposed I was out there alone. I fell back asleep eventually, though not as deeply. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just birds or maybe the wind, but it didn't sound like either. It was this dull, distant thumping, like someone was hitting the ground with a heavy stick over and over. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I sat up and listened carefully, but after about a minute, it stopped. I chalked it up to maybe a falling branch or an animal and didn't think much of it. I made breakfast, drank some water, and decided to hike a bit further into the woods. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just wanted to explore. I left my camp set up since I planned to return by evening. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, a flashlight, and my map. I also brought my knife just in case. The forest was beautiful that time of year. The leaves were turning colors: reds, oranges, yellows, and the sun came through the trees in this soft, golden light. The ground was a little damp from the rain a few days back, and I had to watch my footing in some areas, but otherwise, the hike was peaceful. I saw a few deer, a rabbit, and even a hawk flying overhead. For a while, I forgot about the sound I'd heard that morning. Around mid-afternoon, I realized I'd wandered pretty far. I checked my map and figured I should start heading back. I turned around and started retracing my steps. That's when I saw it. There were boot prints in the soft dirt. Not mine. These were bigger, heavier, and they weren't there when I passed through earlier. I stopped and looked around, but everything was quiet. The prints went off in a different direction from where I came, deeper into the woods. I stood there for a long minute, just listening. Nothing. I considered following them for a second, but my gut told me not to. Instead, I picked up my pace and headed back to camp. When I got back, something felt off. Nothing looked touched at first, but when I walked over to my tent, I noticed the zipper wasn't closed all the way. I was sure I'd zipped it shut before leaving. I crouched down and opened it the rest of the way. Inside, everything looked in place, but my sleeping bag was slightly unrolled, and the small bag I kept my snacks in was open. It wasn't torn like an animal had gotten into it. It looked like someone had opened it carefully and looked through it. I stood up slowly and scanned the trees around the clearing. Still nothing. No movement. No sounds. But I could feel it, that sense you get when you know you're not alone. I packed my bag as fast as I could. I thought about leaving right then and there, but it was already getting late, and hiking out in the dark wasn't a great idea. I decided to stay one more night but sleep lightly and leave at first light. I didn't build a fire that night. I didn't cook anything. I just ate a protein bar and got into my tent while it was still barely light out. I kept my knife in my sleeping bag and laid there, listening. Every sound seemed louder now. The crack of a twig, the rustle of wind in the branches. My heart wouldn't slow down. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up again just after midnight to a soft crunching sound outside the tent. Not an animal. The steps were slow and deliberate, too heavy for a raccoon or deer. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I held the knife tight in my hand, my body frozen. The footsteps stopped right next to my tent. I could hear them breathing slow, steady, quiet. My whole body was tense. I waited for something to happen. A hand on the tent. A voice. Anything. But nothing came. The breathing eventually faded, and after what felt like an hour, I didn't hear any more footsteps. I stayed awake the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started to turn gray, I packed up fast. I didn't even eat. I shoved everything into my bag and started hiking back to the car. I kept checking over my shoulder the whole way. When I reached my car, there was a fresh scratch along the driver's side door, long and deliberate. It hadn't been there before. I threw my stuff in the back, got in, and locked the doors. The forest was still and quiet, but I didn't feel any peace anymore. I started the engine and drove off, heart still racing, eyes checking the mirrors constantly. On the way back, I kept thinking about everything. The sound that first morning, the footprints, the tent zipper, the breathing outside in the dark. It hadn't been my imagination. Someone else had been out there, watching, following, maybe just messing with me, or maybe waiting for the right moment. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I'd gotten out of that tent, or made a sound, or stayed another night. When I got home, I told my brother everything. He wanted me to go to the police, but I didn't have much to give them. No face, no name, no real evidence besides a few footprints and a scratch on my car. I didn't even know if whoever it was had done anything technically illegal. I haven't been camping since, at least not alone. That trip reminded me of something important. The forest might seem peaceful, quiet, safe, but just because you don't see anyone doesn't mean no one's there. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't the dark or the wild animals. It's another person, someone with time, patience, and no good reason to be out there at all. It was early October when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been working long hours for the past few months and my mind needed a break. The idea of being out in the woods, alone, without any noise or pressure from the world, sounded like the best way to reset myself. I didn't have a specific location in mind, just a rough plan to drive west until I found a quiet, remote spot. I packed up my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, and some basic tools, and left home early on a Friday morning. By late afternoon, I was deep into a forested area I had never explored before. The road had turned to gravel a while back, and soon I found a small clearing off the side of the track that looked good enough to set up camp. There was no sign of other people around. No cabins, no parked cars, no sounds of traffic. Nothing. just tall pine trees surrounding the area and the steady hum of insects. The ground was mostly flat, soft with fallen needles and dry leaves. A small creek ran nearby, and the sound of its water moving gently over the rocks was calming. I parked the car just off the path and walked a bit to make sure the area felt safe. It did, so I unloaded my gear and set up the tent before the sun dipped too low. I made a small fire ring with rocks and set up my stove just in case I didn't find enough dry wood. I cooked a simple meal, just beans and rice, and sat near the fire as it got dark. The stars came out slowly, and with no city lights, the sky was filled with them. The cold started to settle in, and I pulled on a thicker jacket. Around midnight, I put out the fire completely and crawled into my tent. The cold made it hard to fall asleep, and every sound outside felt louder. Leaves crunching in the wind, twigs snapping. It could have just been squirrels or raccoons, but in the dark, every little thing felt like it carried more weight. Still, I eventually drifted off. The next morning, I woke up early, around 6. The forest was foggy and damp, and everything felt colder than I expected. My clothes were a bit damp from the moisture in the air, and my boots felt stiff. I got up, stretched, and boiled some water for coffee. After breakfast, I decided to go for a hike deeper into the woods. I brought a small pack with me, water, a flashlight, my phone, though there was no signal, a knife, and a few snacks. I didn't plan to go far, maybe just a few miles in and back. First, everything was perfect. The forest was quiet except for birds calling out to each other. The trail I followed was barely visible, more like a game trail than a real path. I stepped over fallen logs, pushed aside low branches, and moved slowly, trying not to get too sweaty. After about an hour, I found a narrow ridge that looked out over a deep valley. I sat down on a rock and just listened. The wind moved through the trees gently. There wasn't a single sign of people. That peaceful silence was exactly what I had been looking for. I started heading back around noon, thinking I would be back at camp by early afternoon. But after walking for a while, something felt wrong. The trail didn't look the same. I thought maybe I had turned the wrong way at some point without noticing. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trees all looked the same, and now the trail was gone altogether. I hadn't marked anything on the way in, no ribbons, no landmarks, just trusted my memory. That was my mistake. I tried to stay calm and walked in what I thought was the direction of camp. But the more I walked, the more confused I got. After another hour or so, I stopped and checked my phone. Still no signal. I tried climbing a large rock formation hoping for some elevation, but it didn't help. All I could see were trees stretching out in every direction. By late afternoon, I accepted that I was lost. I still had water and a bit of food, so I decided to stop moving and build a small fire. I remembered reading that it's better to stay in one place once you know you're lost. I cleared a small area and gathered some dry wood. It was hard to find dry branches because everything was damp from the fog, but I eventually got a small fire going. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, and tried to stay calm. I thought if I waited until morning, I might be able to find my way back in the daylight. That night was cold. I hadn't brought my sleeping bag with me, just a lightweight jacket. I curled up next to the fire, feeding it every hour just to stay warm. Sleep came in short bursts, and I kept waking up, shivering and checking the shadows for movement. I knew there were bears in these woods, though I hadn't seen any signs of them. Still, the thought stayed in my mind the entire night. In the morning, the fire was out and my fingers were stiff from the cold. I got up slowly, drank some of the remaining water, and tried to find my bearings. The sun was coming up to the east, and I tried walking west, guessing that was the direction of my camp. I moved slower now, listening for any familiar sound. The creek maybe, or the road. Hours passed and there was nothing. Just more trees, more brush, and more silence. By the second afternoon, I was out of food and low on water. I found a muddy stream and drank a little. Even though I knew it wasn't safe, I figured dehydration would kill me faster than bad water. I walked for hours again, and finally, just before sunset, I found something. Not my camp, but an old logging road. It looked like no one had used it in years, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere. That night, I didn't stop walking. I was too afraid that if I stopped, I might not get moving again. My legs hurt, my lips were dry, and my stomach was completely empty. But the road kept going, winding through the trees. Eventually, sometime after midnight, I saw something ahead, a gate. A rusty metal gate stretched across the path with a chain and a no trespassing sign. Beyond it, the road turned into pavement. I stepped over the gate and kept walking. After about 20 minutes, I saw a parked car up ahead, an old truck. I knocked on the window, but no one was inside. I rested next to it for a while, too tired to keep going. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, it was already light. A man in his 60s stood next to me. He looked just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. He didn't say anything. I didn't want him to, but he looked at me like he knew I needed help. He opened the truck door, handed me a bottle of water, and gestured for me to get in. I did. We drove in silence for almost an hour before reaching a small town. From there, I found my way to the local sheriff's office. They took my information, gave me food, and called for a ranger to help find my car. Took another day, but we finally located my camp. Everything was still there, untouched. I packed up, thanked the ranger, and drove home. The whole trip had only lasted 3 days, but it felt like weeks. Getting lost like that, with no one around, no clear way out, and no signal, it reminded me how fragile we really are when everything we depend on disappears. I had thought I needed peace and silence, and I got it, just not the way I imagined. I still go hiking and camping now, but I mark my trail. I tell people where I'm going. I bring better gear, more food, and a GPS. I learned the hard way that nature doesn't care about your plans. It just is. I look back on that trip not with fear, but with a strange kind of respect. I got out because I stayed calm and kept moving, even when it felt pointless. There was no big moment, no rescue helicopter, no dramatic search party. Just a long, cold walk back to where people were. And sometimes that's enough.